Videos like this are made possible by my wonderful supporters on Patreon. Check the link below if you'd like to join them, and even get access to exclusive content. Welcome back to Gran Turismo's most memorable cars, the semi-regular series where I dive into the back catalogue to bring you some interesting and obscure stories about some of the many cars that have appeared in these games. Now, I've already covered a lot of cars throughout the previous 4 episodes, 40 to be exact, but such is the depth on offer that we've still barely scratched the surface. Today, we're diving back into the realm of cars that became well known in these games for reasons the developers didn't anticipate. One of my personal favourite topics when it comes to Gran Turismo. Along these lines, I've talked about cars that have become memes, and ones that have even gained infamy within the fanbase. But now we're looking at another variation on this theme, cars with strange claims to fame. These are models that stand out thanks to certain unique traits they have in these games, usually in relation to specific features or design decisions. However, as time has gone on, some of these points have faded into the background, becoming a piece of interesting trivia, but nothing more. That's where I come in, as in this video we're going to dig deeper into these quirks, seeing what impact they really have, and how they came about in the first place. There are even a couple of unsolved mysteries for us to sink our teeth into. If I were to ask you to name a feature that was brought to the series with Gran Turismo 5, there are quite a few options that you could pick, but the one that this entry centers around is paint chips. A bit of background first. From Gran Turismo 1 to Gran Turismo 4, you weren't able to repaint your car. If you bought it from new, you could choose the initial colour, but once you took ownership of it, you were stuck with that colour forever. That was until GT5, where the feature made its long-awaited debut. However, the implementation of this was anything but conventional. The way it worked was that when acquiring a car, you would earn a paint chip of the colour you got it in. This paint chip could then be used as a token to repaint a car or even just its wheels in that same colour. Bear in mind that this paint chip system was the only way to repaint cars in this game, as it wasn't paired with a more traditional paint selection system like we have now in GT7. Paint chips, like many things in GT5, were controversial, as it did address one major complaint from the previous games, but not in a way that fully satisfied most players. What made it worse was that paint chips were one-use items, making them a very valuable commodity, but they were made reusable in GT6. For all of its issues, paint chips did add a new dimension to the collection aspect of Gran Turismo, because what it meant was that certain cars became more desirable purely thanks to the colours they came in. For some cars, it was because of the specific colours they had, and others through the sheer amount of them. The first generation Dodge Charger RT had a whopping 31 paint chips on offer. Now, I don't know this for certain, but I'm 99% sure this is the most of any car in GT5, and in GT6 it was matched only by the Dino 246. For many people, TVR had some of the most interesting colours out there. Not only did cars like the Tuscan Speed 6 have a massive selection of colours, 22 in total, but they included some iridescent or colour shift paints, like Reflex Purple and Reflex Spice. Having these radical factory paint colours is something that TVR was known for in the real world. However, if there is one car that's been almost entirely defined by its paint chips, I think there's only one answer. The Toyota FT86 G Sports concept was first seen at the 2010 Tokyo Auto Salon. It was essentially a factory-tuned version of the Toyota FT86, the concept that would go on to become the GT86. But in spite of its aggressive looks and decent performance, that isn't what most people remember it for in these games. Because in the car's only appearances in GT5 and 6, it comes in 9 different colours, all of which are iridescent. Of course, whether you actually like these colours or not is entirely subjective, but the main point is that they were all totally unique paint chips that were only really comparable to the handful of similar ones from TVR. To me, this makes the FT86 G Sports the most desirable car from a paint chip perspective, something which I can vouch for personally, as I remember spending 4.5 million credits to buy the car in all 9 colours in GT6 back in the day. For paint chip collectors, this car was truly a gift. However, something you've probably not really thought about before is, why does this car come in these colours? They're clearly not factory Toyota paints. You see, whenever the real car was shown off, it was always painted in plain white with some red decals. This was also how the car was depicted in GT5 initially, as we can see from this trailer and early screenshots. However, when the game released in November, it was replaced with the polarized paints instead. The biggest clue actually comes from the names of the colours themselves. Maziora is a type of iridescent paint that was developed by Nippon Paint and used mainly for cars. Fun fact, you know Team Impol, the guys that ran the memorable Calisonic-sponsored Nissans in Super GT for many years? Well, in 1998, they were sponsored by Maziora in Formula Nippon, with their cars painted accordingly. But aside from cars, their paints also have many other applications, from musical instruments to railway locomotives, and even a special Maziora edition of the Sega Dreamcast in 1999. But anyway, the point is that in Japan, Maziora is a fairly well-known brand. The colours that we see on the FT86 make up two different lines of paint. Maziora Everest, McKinley and Matterhorn are from the Alps collection, whereas Mazaran, Safer, Trapezium, Pleiades 2, Andromeda and Andromeda 2 make up the Cosmo collection. They're all very real paints that you can purchase off the shelf and use for whatever you want to. As for why they appeared on this car in GT5 and 6, that's hard to say. Not only does it seem like the car was never actually shown in any of these colours in real life, there doesn't seem to be any mention of Maziora in any press release or statement about the car. It's worth noting that Maziora has partnered with OEMs before, including even Toyota themselves for a special edition of their BB City car. So if Toyota did have some sort of partnership with Maziora for the FT86 G Sports, it seems like it was entirely exclusive to Gran Turismo. But although this car was never actually painted in these colours in real life, plenty of other cars have been. And thanks to the paint chips, this is also true in Gran Turismo. If I had to guess, I would say that more people have spent time driving a car painted in one of these colours in these games than they have driving the actual car they came from. Well, from a car tied to a feature that debuted in GT5, we take a step back to the previous game. One of the new additions to Gran Turismo 4 was A-Spec points. Essentially, up until this game, there was no way to gauge the actual performance of your car versus your opponents. The best you would have is maybe a rough horsepower estimate. A-Spec points was Gran Turismo's first attempt to address this. The points themselves were calculated based on the average performance of your AI opponents, minus the performance of your own car, plus 60 points. The points would be on a scale of 1 to 200. 1 point indicated that the race would be a walkover, whereas 200 meant that you were in for a world of pain. At least that was the idea. Of course, for any of these calculations to work, this means that there needs to be some sort of rating system for the cars themselves behind the scenes, and GT4 does have one. Although, as it was their first attempt, it's not the best. And there is one vehicle in particular that really highlights this. In terms of cars, GT4 was the first game to feature full-sized pickup trucks, and it's the heaviest of these heavyweights that really shows the cracks. The Dodge Ram weighs almost 2,400 kilos and has 340 horsepower. It's clearly not the fastest thing out there, but is still capable of some performance. However, if you try to use it in pretty much any race, you'll always end up seeing the same thing: 200 A-Spec points. For whatever reason, the Ram is extremely underrated in the point system. In arcade mode, where the game tries to match you with cars of similar performance, you will almost exclusively see K cars, small compacts, and classics, all of which the Ram can easily destroy, even if the game insists that it can't. Let's put this into some context. In terms of how the Ram is rated behind the scenes, in its stock form it's roughly equivalent to a Fiat Panda, a car that weighs 730 kilos but has only 44 horsepower. Just from saying that, you can tell it's already massively off. But if we then calculate a rough horsepower per ton figure, it really underlines the imbalance. In fact, the Ram is actually the 15th lowest ranked normal vehicle in the entire game. So, how did this happen? Well, of the normal vehicles that could be raced in GT4, the Ram is definitely the heaviest. In that case, I would just be tempted to say that the problem is they weighted the rating system too far in favour of lightness, with power not being enough of a factor to make up the difference. However, if we look at the other heavyweight vehicles, we can see that's not the case. Take the Chevrolet SSR. It's another pickup truck with similar specs to the Ram, 289 horsepower and 2,248 kilos. Despite it having a slightly worse power to weight ratio, it's actually a bit faster than the Ram, and if you try to use it in arcade mode, you'll see much tougher opponents that actually justify the 200 A-Spec points. In terms of the ranking, the SSR is actually rated dead even with the Lotus Elise and Toyota Corolla Aero Tourer. If we again do a rough weight versus power calculation, we can see that they're much closer competitors. In fact, this shows that the SSR is probably slightly overrated in this system. So, as for why the Ram is so underrated, that's still a mystery. You would imagine that they had some sort of rough calculation to work out their rankings, so the only possibilities are that either the data for the Ram was entered incorrectly, or never entered at all and they just completely winged it for some reason. Well, regardless of the reasoning, the effects of this are clear. What it means is that arcade mode races with it are incredibly easy, even if you turn the difficulty up to 10. And in GT mode, using the RAM is the best way to win 200-point races. Of course, the irony of this is that ace-bet points don't actually do anything in GT4, but there is still some sense of achievement in earning them. Of course, if we look at the PS3 games onwards, ace-bet points would be replaced by performance points. Now, the performance point system has always been exploitable, but it's still a lot more accurate than its predecessor. For example, here on GT6, the RAM is rated at 410 pp, but the Fiat Panda, which was supposedly slightly better than it in GT4, is rated at 277. These numbers make a lot more sense. GT6 would end up being the RAM's final official appearance in the series so far, but it still retains an overlooked presence in these games. If you load up GT7 and head to a track like Northern Isle Speedway, you can find scenery vehicles that appear to be the very same Dodge Ram. It's almost like we're being haunted by it from beyond the grave. Much like the Ram, our next entry is a car that's appeared in multiple games, but exhibits a weird trait in GT4 specifically. This time we're on the total other end of the performance spectrum. In GT4, you can filter the prototype race cars into two main categories. The first are the outright fastest cars, generally made up of high-power Group C machines like the Sauber C9, Nissan R89C and R92CP, and of course, the legendary Toyota Minolta. These are cars with over 900 horsepower that are almost guaranteed to be the fastest opponents in any event they appear. However, they do have an Achilles heel: tyre wear. And this is where our second category comes in. This group is made up of prototypes that aren't quite as powerful as those in category 1, but as a result, don't wear out their tyres as quickly. As such, there are many occasions where you'll actually find these cars to be your nearest challengers, such as the Audi R8s, the Pescarolo C60s, and Mazda 787B. However, possibly the best example of this type of opponent can be seen at the Super Speedway 150 miles endurance race. The Peugeot 905 is a car that's only in international versions of GT4, but if you encounter it in this event, you will notice. It is the only opponent car that can do the entire race on a single pit stop. So although there will likely be faster opponents, this is the car you really have to beat if you want to win. In fact, it's so good that you may be tempted to get one yourself, but if you do, you're in for a nasty surprise. The Peugeot 905 is notorious for having extremely slow gear shifts. In the lower gears in particular, it is simply agonizing. For a car that supposedly represents cutting-edge performance, albeit in 1992, it is kind of absurd. Needless to say, in real life this wasn't the case. The car was fitted with a state-of-the-art 6-speed sequential transmission, meaning that it was able to shift about as fast as any other car it raced against. The Group C rules in those final years meant that the cars were basically Formula 1 machines with more bodywork. So, the usual questions are how and why. Well, for that first part, we do have a concrete answer, but just a warning, it's gonna get a bit nerdy. The speed at which a car changes up a gear is determined by two factors in GT4, its flywheel inertia stat and its engine braking stat. When a car changes up a gear, it drops down a certain amount of revs before engaging the next gear and then continuing to accelerate. Flywheel inertia determines how quickly it drops down the revs, whereas engine braking determines how many revs it actually drops. By using SpecDB, the internal car database of GT4, we can see exactly what's going on. Whilst the 905 has a flywheel inertia stat that's roughly similar to other comparable race cars, its engine braking stat of 122 leaves a lot to be desired. The higher the engine braking stat, the better, so when you see other prototypes with figures like 250, that says everything you need to know. For comparison, the 905's engine braking stat is roughly equivalent to the Mark V Golf GTI. But it gets worse, because most road cars like the Golf can have clutch and flywheel upgrades which improve these stats, and therefore shift times. Being a top-end race car, the 905 cannot, and is simply always stuck with these agonizing upshifts. As for the why, just like every other stat listed here, there's no way to know the rationale behind them. Maybe it was a mistake and they meant to put 222 instead, or it was an entirely intentional decision. Either way, we have no way of knowing. For GT5, the car was modified to have much faster gear shifts, in line with its rivals, and that was that. For as much as I've highlighted its gear changes here, I have to say that when you look beyond that, I think the 905 is actually a really great car in GT4. It's fairly easy to drive for a prototype. Personally, I think think it handles like a dream, and as I mentioned, its long tyre life is a major plus point. Also, there are ways to combat its prolonged upshifts. One is to simply avoid using lower gears, which are the worst affected. This reduces the amount of times you have to change gear over a lap, and using higher gears also reduces wheel spin and therefore tyre wear. If you want to, you can even bring the gear ratios closer together to improve things across the board. You know, everyone has a favourite Group C car from these games, and if I'm being honest, mine is the 905. Despite being a 2-time Le Mans winner, I kind of feel like it gets forgotten about. I really do hope it comes back to Gran Turismo one day, because it was a very cool car that was simply dealt a bad hand in its first appearance in this series. Speaking of cars that were dealt a bad hand, I don't think it gets much worse than this next case. We once again head over to Gran Turismo 5 for this slice of weirdness. Now, seeing as I've already made a video discussing this topic in depth, there's no need to beat around the bush. Standard cars. The ported over PS2 and PSP models that appeared in the PS3 games alongside their higher fidelity counterparts, dubbed as premium cars. Yep, I'm gonna say it again, this was a very controversial decision in GT5. Whilst it did help to bolster up the car roster to over 1,000 models, you can't deny that they were an eyesore. The biggest offender here were the textures. Things like headlights and taillights, as well as any livery designs, just looked plain awful. Of course, by PS2 standards they were fine, but GT5's updated game engine really exposed their issues. There were numerous, almost countless examples of standard cars that just looked out of place, but there was one that stood head and shoulders above them as the de facto worst looking standard car in GT5. And if we take a look at the thumbnail of that video I made in October 2023, it all becomes very clear. This is the Suzuki Alto Works Limited, a car that originally debuted back in Gran Turismo 2, but it was in GT5 where it suddenly grabbed attention, mainly down to this screenshot that went viral not long after the game release. I mean, I have to assume that if you're watching this video, then you're blessed with the ability of sight, so I don't really need to describe why this car looks so bad, but I'll do it anyway. For one, it has hideous textures as we mentioned. The grey decal along the side is particularly nasty, but something that is uniquely wrong about it is the actual quality of the model. Now, most standard cars were guilty of having jagged edges in places, but this Alto takes things to a whole new level. Just look at the headlights, the wheel arches and the windows. It's almost in an entirely different league when it comes to visuals. Now, as much as I would love to clown on this car even more, there is an important point that has to be mentioned. When GT5 first released, some of the standard car models ended up being slightly distorted. This Alto was one of them, and as a result, it actually looked better in GT4 than it did initially in GT5. However, with the version 1.06 updates, these issues were rectified, and so the Alto looked marginally better, particularly at the front. Sadly, this is all the attention the car would ever receive. Despite Polyphony gradually updating more and more standard cars during the PS3 era, to the point where some could even be considered semi-premium, the Alto stayed exactly like this through to the end of GT6. You would think that given it was very quickly singled out as the worst standard car, they would have spent a little bit of time tidying it up. But as they've proven on many occasions, Polyphony aren't exactly the most in touch with their community. As such, this Alto was just left to be the butt of every standard car joke. Now, there's a couple of interesting things about the Alto that I want to point out. One that often gets forgotten is that this car actually has a duplicate model, the Alto Works RSZ. It's pretty much identical to the Limited, but minus the front lip and rear spoiler. In that case, how come this model rarely ever gets seen when it comes to the standard car discussion? Well, one reason is that it doesn't have the horrific looking stripe, but the second actually comes down to its colour. Ever notice that when the Alto is brought up, you tend to see it in white? This is because white creates a bigger contrast and so shows up the issues even more. The RSZ isn't available in white, so naturally the problems with its model don't stand out as much. Of course, we can then flip this around. The only other colour you can get the Limited in is black, and it looks significantly better because it hides a lot of the flaws. In fact, repainting this car to any colour other than white is bound to improve its appearance. Now, last year I made a video where I covered every single time a Gran Turismo game was delayed. And as part of researching for that video, I stumbled across something quite interesting. When Gran Turismo 4 Prologue was first announced in late 2003, they shared a number of high-resolution renders of the various cars that would be in the game, and one of them was the Alto. However, what caught my attention was how bad the Alto's model looked even back then. Seriously, when compared to models that were also carried over from GT3, it just looked so janky. And that made me realize something. The Alto's model has always sucked. It's just because of the lower resolution of the PS2 games that we never really noticed until GT5. Of course, when playing these PS2 games on an emulator with higher resolution, these issues become much more apparent. In GT3, the only car that really comes close to it is the Daihatsu Mira/Kuore. It too suffers from being very rough around the edges, particularly on the wheel arches and windows, and it was only these renders that made me realize that. I don't imagine it's a coincidence that two of the worst looking cars in GT3 are also the only two K cars in the entire game. Of the two, the Alto does still look noticeably worse though, and it's worth noting that the Mira was one of the cars that was improved considerably in the PS3 era. It even earned semi-premium status within the community. If it was possible for that car, I have truly no idea why they left the Alto to suffer the fate that it did. The Chaparral 2J is a car that every Gran Turismo fan knows about to some degree. Everything about it is just so unorthodox. From its looks, to its method of generating downforce, to even the number of gears, nothing was done by the book. And given that it was outlawed from the Can-Am series it competed in after just a handful of winless races, it remains as one of racing's great what-ifs. Within the realm of Gran Turismo, the 2J debuted in GT4, instantly catching the attention of anyone who came across it. Not only was it very striking to look at, but it also had the performance to back it up. This car can hold its own against the fastest prototypes in the game, benefiting from good traction which also helps with tyre wear. In pretty much any event this car appeared as an opponent, you knew that you had a challenge. Notable examples include the All-American Championship in GT4 and GT5, as well as the historic Racing Car Cup in the latter. For what was essentially a vintage race car, its speed was incredible. But then we come to Gran Turismo 6. Now, whilst everything I've said about the 2J so far is still true in this game, it managed to add an interesting new dimension. In GT6, some cars were able to achieve high speeds in reverse. These were mostly electric vehicles, such as the Tesla Roadster, which makes sense, given that in theory, this car can achieve the same speeds going backwards by just reversing the direction of the electric motor. A quirk of the 2J as a combustion engine car is that as well as having 3 very long forward gears, its reverse gear is also unusually stretched. In GT4, you can make it go 126 miles an hour in reverse straight from the box. However, that is nothing compared to GT6. With some fairly basic tuning, including a Stage 3 turbo kit and a transmission flip, which I'll explain in a bit, this car can be propelled to well over 200 miles an hour facing in the wrong direction. The exact tune I'm using here comes courtesy of Schmo GT, and I'll leave it linked in the description if you want to try it yourself. Now, given that we're operating on one gear, it does take a while to get up to speed, but at a track like Special Stage Route X, we have plenty of space. However, even at a track as simple as this one, we still face some challenges in trying to complete a full lap, that being the 2 massive banked corners on either end of the circuit. So this is where the second part of the tune comes in. This all involves making the car as stable as possible through suspension and differential settings. But the most important factor is the tyres. What you want to do is set the front tyres to racing soft, the grippiest tyres in the game, and the rears to comfort hard, the least grippy. Under normal circumstances, this would make the car a complete mess to drive, given that power goes to its rear wheels, but when in reverse, it helps to lock it into a stable trajectory while still allowing some steering movement. This means that with some careful control, you can get around these corners no problem. In GT6's career mode, there is one single race that takes place at Route X, and it's found in Like the Wind. This race is against some of the fastest cars in the game, but the 2J is capable of making them all look like complete chumps. Is there anything better than being able to look directly at your opponents as you leave them in the dust? But with this race, we can push the 2J even further. These older games are notorious for having an extremely overpowered slipstream effect, and if we take advantage of that here, this car can reach over 300 miles an hour. That puts it just behind some of the outright fastest cars in the entire game, all whilst going backwards. The 2J would return in GT7, but sadly it's not capable of the same trick. It really was just a GT6 special. But whilst we're on the topic of reverse driving, did you know that reverse drifting was also a thing in this game? Sadly, the 2J isn't capable of doing this as well, although I've never actually seen anyone try it. So, the 2J is the king when it comes to high-speed reverse driving, but there was another car that almost took its crown. In Gran Turismo Sports, the tuned Chevy Nova was also capable of hitting incredible speeds in reverse. Just like the 2J, this was mainly thanks to a transmission flip, which is where you set the auto setting to as high as possible, then also put the final gear as high as it'll go, before going back to the auto setting, which glitches the gears and allows them to be set even lower than normally possible. If you then put the final gear all the way to the left, this results in insanely long gears, which also includes reverse. By doing this, the Nova can also get to over 200 miles an hour going backwards, but it's still some way off the 2J. As I've said, even without this exploit, the 2J was already a very unique and memorable car. It really speaks volumes about it when the fact that it was able to go 300 miles an hour in reverse has just become an often forgotten side note. In a video like this, I always try to save the best for last, and boy, do I have an interesting tale for you all. If I were to ask you what the first fictional car, i.e. a car that was never actually made in real life, to ever appear in this series was, what would you say? Some would jump to Vision Gran Turismo for the answer. Vision GT is a collaboration between Gran Turismo and various car manufacturers that started back in 2013 to create unique concept cars to feature in these games. In most cases, these cars were either never made in real life or only exist as physical mock-ups. However, if we jump back another decade, we can find something else. I think a good number of you would say that the first fictional car in Gran Turismo must be the Nike 1 that was first seen in GT4. It was designed in partnership between Nike and Gran Turismo to create their idea of a car of the future, that future now being 3 years ago. In some ways, it was the first ever Vision GT car, long before the project actually began. However, the true answer to this question isn't as clear-cut as it might seem. Gran Turismo 2 brought many new manufacturers to this series for the first time, and one of them was Tommy Kaira. This brand rose to prominence as a tuning company throughout the late 80s and into the 90s, and in 1995 they even developed their own in-house sports car, the ZZ. This car is very real, with over 200 examples being produced, and I even talked about it before in a previous video in this series. But the same can't be said for its potential successors that also appeared in GT2, the ZZ2 and the ZZ3. Counterintuitively, we're going to start with the ZZ3 first. I guess I'll get straight to the point here. There is no evidence to suggest that the Tommy Kaira ZZ3 actually existed in real life. There are no records to show that it was actually made, and no proof of it ever being seen, whether that be on video or just photos. As far as anyone can tell, this car only ever existed in GT2. However, unlike the Nike 1 or any of the Vision GTs, this car was not a concept designed in collaboration with Gran Turismo. It was intended to be made as a real car. Its description in GT2 makes this very clear, as well as highlighting some of the ZZ3's theoretical features. What's fascinating is that this small piece of text is some of the only information about this car anywhere on the internet. In fact, I would be tempted to say that this car was just one big joke that Polyphony came up with just to mess with everyone, if it weren't for one crucial piece of evidence. There exists an image taken from a Japanese magazine that shows a concept drawing of the ZZ3, albeit with slightly different proportions from the version in GT2. Outside of the game, this is the only proof I can find of this car actually being in development. I guess the question then is whether the car we see in GT2 is based solely on these drawings, or if Polyphony was privy to more information. From looking at the car in GT2, it seems to have similar proportions to the ZZ, and is also very close in spec. Does this mean that the ZZ3 was intended to be heavily based on the ZZ, or did Polyphony just make that assumption based on a lack of available information? Either way, I think it's pretty fascinating that this car ended up in the game at all. One interesting point is that the car description I showed you earlier was removed from the PAL version of GT2 that came out in January 2000, instead replaced by the same description from the ZZ. Does this imply that by that time the ZZ3 project was already dead? It's entirely possible. It's worth mentioning that there are rumours that the ZZ3 morphed into the ASL Garaya, which itself would also appear in Gran Turismo starting in GT4. However, although it's true that ASL essentially took over Tommy Kaira's sports car division in 2001, I can't find any concrete evidence to confirm that beyond just hearsay. In discussing the ZZ and the ZZ3, we're obviously ignoring the missing link, the ZZ2. Much like the original ZZ, it would also go on to reappear in the series from GT3 all the way through to GT6. However, when you compare this version of the car to the version from GT2, you will notice something. They look completely different. As you can probably guess, this means there's another interesting story to tell here. With the ZZ dad being killed off prematurely in 2000, Tommy Kaira was looking to go bigger with their next project. What they envisioned was essentially a road-going GT race car that could be bought off the shelf and then ran in various championships with only minor modifications. The car could be fitted with various different engine configurations depending on which category it was competing in. This initial concept of the car is the version we see depicted in GT2, featuring a very low and aggressive profile as well as a large detached rear wing. However, as time went on, the car would eventually morph into something else entirely. Just a couple of years later, the ZZ2 would be officially unveiled in its new form. This version was no longer a hardcore track-focused car, but instead a more refined high-performance sports car. It was powered by the RB26 DETT from the Nissan R34 GTR, but with many modifications that brought power to around 550 horsepower. It also utilized the Atessa system from the GTR, making it all-wheel drive, compared to the previous design which only powered the rear wheels. Only one model of the ZZ2 was ever made, however this isn't actually what the version we see in Gran Turismo is based on. You see, the ZZ2 was officially unveiled at the Tokyo Auto Salon in January 2002, but Gran Turismo 3 released some 8 months earlier. How is this possible? Simple, the car we see in GT3 is actually based on the 1/5 scale clay model of the finalized design that was created prior to the actual car itself. What this means is that the ZZ2 we see from GT3 onwards has some differences from the real thing. For example, it lacks the front indicators which the real car took from a Toyota Celica, and it also has different side mirrors. The ones on the real car were sourced from an Audi TT. This also explains why it's listed in-game as a 2000 model year, since the design it's based on was finalized in December 2000. Polyphony would never remodel the ZZ2, so this is the way it stayed all the way until GT6 in 2013. It has to be mentioned that this car is also considered to be one of the most overpowered cars in Gran Turismo. It has supercar levels of performance, and yet only costs about 60,000 credits in the PS3 games. It was also known for being incredibly good in GT6 when it came to performance point limited events, often dominating seasonal event leaderboards. So that's the story of the ZZ2 in Gran Turismo, but if we take a look back to the version in GT2, we're left with similar questions to the ZZ3. As this version of the car was a rear-wheel drive GT, and the version that was actually made was essentially an R34 GTR in the form of a mid-engine supercar, the only thing they really share is the name. So again, did the version seen in GT2 ever exist? Well, unlike the ZZ3, there is a lot more information online about the ZZ2's development. The design of the car was done by Noriyuki Nishida from Design Apple, who formerly worked for racing car constructor Dome. Not only was he responsible for the styling of the car that was actually made, but he's also the man behind the original design. These drawings come from Design Apple and depict the car almost exactly as it appears in GT2. So, just like the ZZ3, it seems like this car was also based purely on drawings and never actually physically existed, right? Well, there is one small piece of evidence I found that may contradict this. Take a look at this picture. Now, whilst it isn't a perfect match with the car from GT2, it does share many details, including the front-end design and headlights, side and roof air intakes, and a rear wing. To me, this car almost looks like a cross between the two versions of the ZZ2. Its styling generally mirrors the GT2 version, but its more toned-down road car aesthetic seems to imply that it's following the ethos of the car from GT3 onwards. I've considered the possibility that this is some sort of render, but looking at the details, I just can't believe that it is. If it is real, then this is most likely the only picture of the original design ZZ2 anywhere on the internet. The earliest posting of this image I can find is from a French forum in June 2004, but it was also later posted to Yoshikazu Tomita's personal blog in 2008. In case you don't know, he's the Tommy in Tommy Kaira. For what it's worth, I scoured the entirety of his blog to try and find any new information about this photo and the car pictured in it, but aside from confirmation that this is supposed to depict the ZZ2, there simply isn't anything. So assuming it is real, the questions we really need answers to are, what is this car, and where did this picture even come from? Unless someone asked Tomita personally, I don't think we're gonna get any closer to the truth anytime soon. But mysteries like these only add to the mystique of these cars. In an era where everything is so thoroughly documented, cases like these are almost kind of refreshing. Tommy Kaira as a brand clearly didn't have the biggest presence in Gran Turismo, but if you ask me, they definitely had one of the most fascinating. Gran Turismo has always been a series about enjoying cars and car culture, but we can't ignore the influence that motorsport has had on it. Real-world race cars have always been a cornerstone of these games, dating all the way back to 1997, and as time has gone on, this franchise has only expanded its motorsport reach. Super GT, DTM, World Rally, NASCAR, Le Mans, Formula 1, and plenty more racing categories have had representation in these games over the years. And it doesn't stop at merely race cars that exist in real life. Polyphony has become somewhat renowned for creating their own racing variants, and even completely original designs, such as through their Vision GT initiative. All of this is to say that Gran Turismo loves its race cars. However, even though the series has shone a light on many different racing categories, there will always be some areas that receive less attention than others. Of course, there are types of races which have never appeared in these games, but what I find the most fascinating are the ones that have only ever existed on the very fringes. Today, I've picked out a selection of race cars from these games that stand alone as the only example from their respective racing series, category, or discipline. Through the course of this video, we'll not only cover how the cars appeared in these games, but also their real-life racing exploits and the unique championships they raced in. Being a Japanese franchise, it's no surprise that Japanese race cars have received so much attention in these games over the years. The appearance of its cars in Gran Turismo was a major factor in why Super GT, previously the JGTC, started gaining popularity overseas. However, for this first entry, we'll be talking about a car from a far lesser known championship. The Fuji Super Silhouette series ran for a few years in the late 70s and early 80s. The top class of cars were built to Group 5 regulations, also known as special production cars. In reality, these machines shared very little with their production counterparts beyond some styling cues, hence them being more commonly referred to as Super Silhouettes. In 1982, Nissan debuted a new car to compete in the series, the Skyline RS Silhouette Formula. It was based on the DR30 Nissan Skyline, and as per the regulations, used the same 2.1-litre 4-cylinder engine block. However, like most other Group 5 racers, it was then turbocharged, with two Garrett T05Bs helping to push out around 560 horsepower. In a car that weighed in at just over a ton, this gave it some serious performance. The Tomica-sponsored car was campaigned by Hosseimi Motorsport, with team founder and racing legend Masahiro Hosseimi being one of the drivers. Fast forward to 1999, and this car would be chosen to appear in Gran Turismo 2, albeit with its name spelled wrong. GT2 and typos, name a more iconic duo. Despite being one of the older race cars in this game, it can still keep up with far newer machines, such as the latest GT500s. Impressive performance and outrageous styling are always a great combination when it comes to making a car memorable in these games. Just look at the Pikes Peak Escudo for proof. However, there is another reason why this car is so fondly remembered in GT2. This car can be won as a prize, which means that you're a lot more likely to encounter it during a playthrough, but it's the event that it can be won from that really matters, the 5th race of the 80s Sports Car Cup. This is a race against sub-300 horsepower road cars on one of the easiest circuits in the game, and it only takes a few minutes. Really, the hardest part of beating it is acquiring the IB license you need to enter in the first place. Through this one race, you can go from your starter car with light upgrades, straight into a race car that's fast enough to beat pretty much any event it's eligible for, including the final championship in the game. Using the Skyline Silhouette to break GT2's progression to such an absurd degree was always going to cement this car's place in Gran Turismo folklore. And for a while, that's how things stayed. Despite its very memorable appearance, this car wasn't chosen to return in GT3 or any of the sequels thereafter. At least, that was until July 2022 when the car made a surprise return in GT7's Update 1.19. After more than 22 years away from the series, the Skyline Silhouette was back and looking better than ever. Like with most race cars that appeared in the older games, its performance isn't as incredible as it used to be, but it's still decent. The car was also placed into the Group 3 racing class, which makes it quite a strange outlier in a field of mostly modern GT3 machines. The nature of GT7 as a game, with the structured racing groups, and the fact that career mode is now far less important, means that cars like these just don't feel as special as they were in the older games. However, it's still pretty cool to see this car in a modern day racing game in such high detail. When it comes to the real-life exploits of this car, given the relative obscurity of the series it raced in, there isn't a huge amount of information to go on. What we do know is that the car competed from 1982 until the end of 1984 when the series folded, winning 8 races in that time. These Group 5 silhouette cars were known for their very distinctive styling, a result of trying to maximize the car's dimensions within the legal limits, and it's cars like these that inspired this aspect of the Bosozoku subculture in Japan, where people modify their road cars with extreme visual enhancements. I think it's also worth quickly mentioning the Nissan Skyline Turbo C. This car is very commonly mistaken for the Skyline silhouette, given that it was also run by Hasemi Motorsport and in a very similar livery. However, the two are linked mechanically also, as the Turbo C started life as an endurance racing version of the Skyline silhouette. For 1983, it was rebuilt as a Group C car for the All Japan Endurance Championship. It didn't achieve any success though, competing 5 times and failing to finish in any of its races. After that, it was sadly destroyed. But fortunately, the Skyline silhouette is still around as part of Nissan's heritage collection. Over the course of its existence, there were plenty of memorable Group 5 racers, such as the Porsche 935, Lancia Beta Monte Carlo, Ford Capri, BMW M1, and plenty more. Whilst it is a shame that we haven't seen more of these cars feature in Gran Turismo, I think the fact that this Skyline is still the only Group 5 car to ever appear in this series is pretty fitting. Australia. They've given us many great things over the years. Vegemite, the didgeridoo, that guy who does all the racing game reviews for IGN. But if there is one thing to come from Australia that I appreciate more than any other, it would probably be their Supercars Championship. When you think of big V8s, your mind will likely jump to the US racing scene, but the Aussies have a pretty rich history with them too. The V8 Supercars Championship officially began back in 1997, with Ford and Holden as the sole protagonists. Their big 5-litre touring cars produced a style of racing that wasn't exactly like anything else. By 2000, the series was starting to gain international interest. The previous year, Ford had introduced a new car based on their AU Falcon, which they were hoping to use to dethrone Holden after several years of dominance. This car was dubbed the Falcon XR8, and one of the teams to run it was Glenn Seton Racing. With the release of Gran Turismo 3 the following year, the number 5 car driven by Glenn Seton himself, as well as Neil Crompton for a couple of the endurance rounds, would appear in the game. However, rather than being branded as a Ford, it was instead listed as a Tickford. In case you're wondering, Tickford was essentially Ford Australia's performance division at the time, similar to Holden's special vehicles. They were responsible for the road-going Falcon XR8 as well. Ford bought out Glenn Seton Racing in 1999, and from that point onwards, they became known as Ford Tickford Racing, hence the car being branded a Tickford in the game. Side note, Tickford built a special version of the Falcon called the XR8 Rebel, which was sold with a copy of GT3 and a PlayStation 2. Neat. Also, I seem to remember seeing an Australian advert for GT3 that featured this car and Glenn Seton, but after looking for ages, I can't seem to find it again. Anyway, in GT3, this car is a bit of an outlier. Performance-wise, it's similar to the mid-tier GT cars. Think GT500s, Viper and Corvettes, etc. But even though it packs 600 horsepower, its extra weight costs it in acceleration and handling. Being a 4-door saloon car, I guess that isn't too surprising. Its price of 1.5 million credits means that it isn't really worth buying either, unless you're a die-hard fan, but you do have a 1 in 4 chance of winning it from the Super Speedway endurance race. Moving on to GT4, the car would return, and at a much more reasonable price, but strangely, it underwent a change of brand, from Tickford to Ford Australia. It's worth noting that this Falcon wasn't only the first V8 supercar in the series, but also the first Australian car. In GT4, it would be joined by a couple of road cars from Holden, and also a couple of newer BA Falcons branded as FPVs, meaning Ford Performance Vehicles. To explain, in 2001, Tickford was bought out by ProDrive, and its venture with Ford was renamed to Ford Performance Vehicles, hence the removal of the Tickford name as well as any reference to it on the car itself. The XR8 would then go on to appear in the PS3 games, albeit as a standard PS2 model, before disappearing from the series after GT6. As for this car's story in real life, Seton would drive the number 5 car to 5th in the 2000 championship with a single win in race 2 of the 8th round at Winton. The sister number 6 car, which was driven by Neil Crompton for most of the year, didn't perform as well, but it did have a moment of glory when Wayne Gardner drove it to pole position for that year's Bathurst 1000. Incidentally, the number 5 car was in contention to win that race before being taken out by a Holden. It's cool that this car appeared in Gran Turismo at all, but at the same time, I am sad that there weren't more like it. Think about this. Nissan raced in the Supercars Championship with an Ultima from 2013 through to 2019, but it never appeared in Gran Turismo. Bear in mind that those were the GT Academy days when Nissan and Gran Turismo were extremely close. In fact, at one point they even ran a special GT Academy livery on one of their cars. In a cruel twist of fate, it was actually Forza Motorsport where the Ultima would end up, as several cars from the championship have appeared in that series ever since FM3. With Mount Panorama, the famous Australian circuit that hosts the Bathurst 1000, appearing in every GT game since GT6, I thought it was almost guaranteed that more Aussie supercars would appear in some form, yet they still haven't. But not all hope is lost. Toyota are planning to enter the Supercars Championship in 2026, and with Gran Turismo seemingly on a quest to add every Toyota ever made, who knows what could happen? Maybe this story isn't finished just yet. Actually, speaking of Toyota, that's a convenient segue to our next entry. As a brand, Toyota has easily some of the most iconic race cars to this series. The GT1, the Minolta 88CV, and of course, the Castrol Tom Supra. But there is one that I feel often gets unfairly overlooked. Prior to it becoming a Formula 1 event, the Japanese Grand Prix was run for sports cars. Held at the fearsome original Fuji Speedway, in the late 60s it was an all-out battle between Nissan and Toyota for domestic supremacy. The fastest cars were built to Group 7 regulations. Much like the 2000 GT road car, Toyota collaborated with Yamaha to develop their racer, and the end result was known as the Toyota 7. Debuting at the Japanese GP in 1968, the 7 wasn't enough to overcome Nissan and their Chevrolet-powered R381. So Toyota went back to the drawing board and came up with what they called the new 7. The previous 3-litre V8 was replaced with a new 5-litre unit, but Nissan was one step ahead as they had developed a 6-litre V12 for their R382, using it to once again take the honours at Fuji. By this point, Toyota was pretty fed up with being bested by Nissan yet again, so for 1970, they took a radical step. The 7 was upgraded yet again. With the use of new materials, the car was lightened significantly, but what was even more significant was the new engine. Again, it was a 5-litre V8, but now fitted with 2 experimental Garrett turbochargers, making the car capable of roughly 800 horsepower. This made the new Toyota turbocharged 7 easily one of the fastest race cars of its day, and it would go on to be immortalized in Gran Turismo 4 several decades later. GT4 introduced a slew of prototype race cars, including those from the famed Group C era, but it really speaks volumes of this car's explosive speed that, in the right hands, the 7 can keep up with just about any of them. Its short wheelbase means that it isn't the easiest thing to handle, and it also suffers from understeer in high-speed corners, but in a straight line, it's an absolute rocket. The only way to acquire the car in this game is from completing driving missions 25 to 29, aka the first half of the one-lap magic missions. Certainly no easy feat, but this does help to give the car an even stronger mystique. Now, at this point, I know there will be a few of you who think I made a mistake by including this car in this video. That's because it's not the only Group 7 sports car to ever appear in these games. In fact, GT4 brought another one to the series. The Chaparral 2J is a car that I've already covered in a previous video, and it competed in the Can-Am series in 1970 before quickly being outlawed. However, given its radical fan car approach, it doesn't really resemble the Toyota 7 or any other Group 7 race car ever made. It kind of exists as its own separate thing. As such, I still think this makes the 7 something of an outlier in this series as well. Like the 2J, it would then go on to appear in GT5 and GT6, albeit in standard form. Aside from both being Group 7 race cars, the other thing the 7 and 2J have in common is that they're both by far the fastest race cars from this era in these games. In the historic Racing Car Cup event that appears in both GT5 and GT6, they're infamous for being extremely tough opponents that you'll most likely have to try and beat with a far inferior machine. In fact, in the PS3 games, the Toyota 7 actually has a higher performance point rating than even the mighty Minolta. To be honest, the fact that the 2J is so fondly remembered is a big part of the reason why the Toyota 7 gets somewhat overlooked in this series. I mean, the 2J has since returned in GT7 as something of a series icon, in a similar vein to the Escudo Pikes Peak and the older GT500s. However, the Toyota 7's chances of returning, I think, are extremely slim. The real-life 2J is notable for being a massive what-if situation, as it only raced a handful of times and was never able to show its true potential. The Toyota 7's story was similar, but even more ill-fated. In 1969, Toyota factory driver Sachio Fukazawa was killed testing an experimental closed cockpit version of the new 7. The fallout from this accident was immense, as Toyota quickly went into damage control. They disposed of any evidence of the accident, including the car itself, and even stated that the cause was driver error, despite witnesses at the scene not being able to confirm that. This all led to a drawn-out legal process that ended with Toyota paying out 61 million yen to Fukazawa's family. Although the turbocharged 7 was mainly intended to conquer the Japanese Grand Prix, it would never get the chance to. Having developed their own new challenger for 1970, the R383, Nissan made the shock decision to pull out of the Japanese GP as a result of the company's shifting priorities. With their arch-rivals out of the picture, Toyota followed suit, instead focusing their efforts on a planned assault on the North American Can-Am series. However, when testing the car at Suzuka in August, another tragedy would occur. Minoru Kawai, who would emerge as Toyota's new lead driver, lost control of the car with what is believed to be a stuck throttle. In the resulting accident, he was killed instantly. With a cloud still hanging over the project from Fukazawa's death the year before, the turbocharged 7 was soon shelved, having never competed in a single race. It's quite amazing to think that, had things been slightly different, the Toyota 7 and the Chaparral 2J could have been lining up on the grid together, something that's now only possible in Gran Turismo. Back when I covered the Toyota 88CV, I made the point of how strange it was for them to include this car specifically in Gran Turismo, given how it never really achieved anything in real life. But arguably, the inclusion of the Toyota 7 is even more bizarre, as it represents one of the company's darkest periods in racing. However, there's still no denying that as a machine it was extremely impressive, and represented an important milestone for the brand. Remember, it was one of the first ever turbocharged race cars, and even though it never got to prove itself in real life, we can be thankful that it's at least able to in Gran Turismo. Rally racing has been a staple of Gran Turismo ever since the second game in the series. Being the most high-profile form of rallying, the World Rally Championship has naturally been the most represented in these games, with many different cars spanning multiple eras. However, this series has also touched on other areas of off-road racing. Rally Raid is one example, with there being a handful of cars that have competed at the Dakar Rally making their way into these games. But there is a form of mixed condition racing that's only had a single representative over the course of this series. Ice racing is a form of motorsport that's not too dissimilar to rallycross, but takes place specifically on ice and snow-covered circuits. The most well-known form of ice racing is the Andros Trophy, which began in France in the early 90s. As the decade went on, it began to steadily grow in popularity, to the point where it started to attract big-name drivers from the world of motorsport, as well as full-on manufacturer teams. One of the brands to throw their hat into the ring was Opel. In 1997, they employed Snowbeck Racing to develop a new machine based on their Tigra. Powered by a V6 sourced from the Opel Omega, the car was also equipped with four-wheel drive and built around a tube frame chassis with carbon fiber bodywork. With Gran Turismo 2 bringing off-road racing to the series for the first time, it was this car that was chosen to represent the Andros Trophy. Of course, the irony of this is that GT2 didn't have any ice or snow circuits, only tarmac and gravel. Still, that doesn't stop it from being an absolute weapon. In real life, the Tigra weighed less than a ton and made around 400 horsepower. These were already pretty impressive stats, but the version in GT2 goes a step further as it boasts well over 500 horsepower. GT2 and getting car specs wrong. Name a more iconic, I've done this joke already. This makes the Tigra easily one of the fastest rally cars in the entire game. If you compare it to the WRC machines, they don't stand a chance. Even the handful of Group B monsters look tame in comparison. And not only can this car do the business on the dirt, but also on the tarmac. It really doesn't get talked about often enough, but this Tigra is so absurdly quick to the point where it can beat the fastest GT cars in the game. However, in spite of its giant killer status, there is just one problem with this car in GT2, and it actually has nothing to do with the car itself. The issue is this. the Suzuki Escudo Pikes Peak. Effectively, the Escudo, and to a lesser extent the Cultus, was everything the Tigra was and a whole lot more. Another oddball rally weapon with absurd amounts of power and downforce, which could crush pretty much anything else on dirt and tarmac. It also looked completely ridiculous too. Pretty much anyone who played this game knew that the Escudo was king, and its subsequent appearance in every numbered game in the series after this truly cemented it as a GT legend. The Tigra, meanwhile, would be dropped from GT3 onwards and became just a minor footnote in the history of this franchise. In real life, however, it would be far more decorated. Driven by an all-star lineup which included former World Rally champion Marco Elen and future touring car legend Ivan Muller, the Tigra would take back-to-back Andros Trophy titles in 1998 and 1999, courtesy of the latter. After that, it was replaced by a car based on the second-generation Astra, which is possibly referenced in GT2 by way of a racing modification that bears a very similar livery. Beyond this, the Tigra would continue to be raced in the series by various other teams all the way into the mid-2000s. Although there have been no other Andros Trophy cars in Gran Turismo since, ice racing did make its debut in the series, starting with GT4. This game brought snow tracks in the form of Chamonix, and most notably Ice Arena, which strongly resembles the types of compact circuits that were commonly raced on in real life. An interesting detail is that Ice Arena is supposedly located in Canada, something that's also true of Lake Louise in GT7, and in 2003, Canada became the first country to host an Andros Trophy event outside of Europe. By the way, the winner of that inaugural event in Sherbrooke in 2003 was a certain Alain Prost. It is a shame that we haven't seen other cars from this series appear in more racing games, because there have been some really interesting ones over the years. From a V8 powered Beetle, to the Daewoo Lanos, Renault Twingo, and plenty of other weird and wonderful machines. In a sad piece of news that seemed to go completely under the radar, the Andros Trophy actually ended after the 2023/2024 season. Ice racing has always had a unique problem: there not being enough ice. Increasing temperatures meant that it was becoming difficult to run the series over the winter months without relocating it completely. Given its appearance in GT2, the Tigra will remain as easily the most recognizable Andros Trophy car ever. A few months ago, I was asked on one of my Patreon Q&As what I thought was the most underrated car in Gran Turismo, and after giving it a bit of thought, I settled on the Tigra Ice race car. People really need to start talking more about just how good this car is as an all-rounder, and at just 500,000 credits, I think it's a steal. If I'm being honest, this car is actually one of my all-time personal favorites in Gran Turismo. For me, it just has a bit of everything. It's unique and interesting, it looks awesome, and it drives superbly. What more could you really want? In this video, we've already covered cars built for racing series in Japan, Australia, and France. So why don't we add another country to our list? If we head back over to GT4, we can find cars hailing from South Korea for the first time. We have a selection of Hyundai models, including the brand's Accent World Rally car, as well as the extremely obscure Proto Motors Spira, an attempt to build the country's first ever supercar. However, this is only what we can find in the international releases of the game. You see, there was a specific version of GT4 that was only ever released in South Korea, NTSC-K. Functionally, it's pretty similar to the Japanese NTSC-J release, but there are a few noteworthy differences. Aside from the text language, the main one surrounds the inclusion of a few exclusive cars. 2001 saw the birth of a new motor racing category in South Korea, what would soon become known as the BAT GT Championship. The name GT Championship was somewhat misleading, as really it was a touring car series. Although the top class of cars was called GT1, they were much closer in spec to the GT300 machines of the day, having roughly 250 horsepower and a minimum weight of 1,000 kilos. For the 2004 season, Toyota Motors Korea decided to throw their hat into the ring, with a car based on the Lexus IS200. The chassis was actually built directly by Toyota Racing Development, or TRD, and it boasted an impressive aerodynamic package that gave the car a very wide and imposing stance. Under the hood, it packed a tuned version of the 3SGE 4-cylinder from the Japanese market Toyota Altezza. So, even though it wasn't a Korean-made car, the inclusion of the Lexus IS200 GT1 race car in the Korean version of GT4 can be seen as a neat bit of representation for the domestic racing scene. In this game, it is a very decent low-end race car, but it does get outperformed by similarly priced GT300 machines. By the way, ever notice the Gran Turismo logos on the car's windscreen banner and number boxes? Well, the reason for this is actually censorship. The BAT and BAT GT Championship is in deference to the series' main sponsor, British American Tobacco. Of course, this blatant tobacco reference was never going to fly in-game, so it had to be covered up. That said, you will also notice PlayStation 2 logos on the car, which relates to sponsorship from Sony Computer Entertainment Korea. Interestingly, when the car was unveiled in real life in early 2004, these were Gran Turismo 4 logos instead. As far as I can tell, the car never actually raced with the GT4 stickers, but this does go some way to explain how it ended up in the game at all. Although I can't say this for certain, I'm fairly confident there must have been a promotional tie-up, like what we saw with the Tickford Falcon in GT3. Anyway, this car would go on to also appear in GT5 and GT6, once again still as a PS2 model. But what's crucial about these appearances is that it would now be available in every region, so for the majority of players, these are the games we actually remember it from. One point of contention about this car is its nationality. Despite being a Japanese-made car, in GT4 it's labelled as being from South Korea. That's despite Lexus being listed as an American brand, as a car's nationality can be different from the manufacturers in this game. In GT5, Lexus would be corrected to a Japanese brand, but the IS200 race car was still stated as South Korean. It wouldn't be until this car's final appearance in the series so far in GT6 that it was finally recognised as Japanese. In real life, this car was driven by Hwang Jin-woo in the 2004 BAT GT Championship. He would win a single race that season, becoming the series' youngest ever race winner at just 21 years old, and would eventually finish third in the championship. At this time, Hyundai cars were the dominant force in the series, with there only being a handful of international models represented. For 2005, the Lexus returned to completely dominate the series, winning 4 out of the 7 races and becoming the first non-Korean made car to win the championship. Hwang Jin-woo would also become the youngest ever series champion, and he would score a second title with the car the following year. As part of my research, I also stumbled across this Hyundai that competed in the 2006 season with a very familiar looking livery. From 2007, the Korean GT Championship would evolve into the Super Race Championship, and has since shifted focus to silhouette stock cars in its top Super 6000 class. I'll be honest, the Lexus IS200 GT1 isn't one of the most interesting cars to have ever appeared in Gran Turismo. A Lexus IS/Toyota Altezza based touring car had already been seen before, and performance-wise it's nothing special. However, this car has to go down as one of the most obscure race cars to ever appear in these games. Outside of South Korea, nobody knows basically anything about this car or the championship it raced in, beyond its brief description in Gran Turismo. Hopefully with this video I've been able to change that, even just a little bit. For our final section, we're going to be focusing on Le Mans prototypes, or LMPs. Outside of Formula cars, these are commonly viewed as the fastest race cars out there. For many people, the first prototype race cars that spring to mind will be those from the famed Group C era of the 80s and early 90s. True monsters that were capable of 240 plus miles an hour on the pre-chicanes Lausanne. But even if we look at more recent examples, we can still find some truly incredible machines, such as the LMP1 hybrids of the 2010s. Porsche's 919 in unrestricted Evo form was even capable of beating Formula 1 lap times at some circuits. But by focusing on just the fastest prototypes, we do risk ignoring the rest of what the class has to offer. The LMP2 category emerged in the early 90s as an entry-level form of prototype racing. The cars were similar to the top-line LMP1 machines, but lighter and less powerful owing to the use of smaller production-based engines. Around the mid-2000s, Zytek Engineering was emerging as a prototype constructor, first in LMP1 and then later in LMP2. They managed a decent amount of success in the latter, including a Le Mans Series title in 2009. With the rules changing in 2011, they had to build an entirely new car to continue competing, and the end result would become known as the Zytek Z11 SN. Rather than building their own engine, which they had done previously, they signed a deal with Nismo to use their 4.5-litre V8 that was currently powering their GT500 GTRs. This pairing produced results almost immediately, with Greaves Motorsport racing the car in the Le Mans series and managing to win the LMP2 title, as well as the 24 Hours of Le Mans in class. Just a few years earlier, Nissan started collaborating with Gran Turismo to create the GT Academy competition, where they aimed to take the fastest Gran Turismo players and turn them into real-life racing drivers. So in 2013, they worked with Greaves to enter a Zytek at Le Mans that would be driven by 2008 GT Academy champion Lucas Ordóñez, 2011 European champion Jan Mardenborough, and experienced Nissan Works driver Michael Krum. And it's this very car that would eventually make its way into Gran Turismo 6 through an in-game update in 2015. I guess it's pretty fitting that this car was added specifically for use in that year's online GT Academy competition, although it is of course usable in the rest of the game. As the only LMP2 car in GT6, the Zytek kind of stands in an awkward place. By nature, it's not fast enough to compete with most of the other prototypes in this game, except for a few of the much older models. It also cannot be upgraded, unlike many other race cars. At 1.5 million credits, it also isn't that much cheaper than the bigger prototypes, but it was given as a prize from the aforementioned GT Academy competition back in 2015. So the Zytek doesn't really have much functional purpose in this game, but in spite of that, I really like it. It's one of those cases where a car is appealing simply through being fun to drive. There's a sort of directness to the way it handles that you just don't get with the more powerful prototypes. At some of the twistier tracks, it isn't actually that far off, and given the pretty poor AI in this game, you can often use it to win races you really shouldn't be able to. But of course, we can't ignore the significance of this car in the series as a whole. Touching on its real-life story, the team that included 2 GT Academy graduates would go on to finish 4th at Le Mans in 2013, but they would be promoted to 3rd after a car ahead of them was disqualified post-race. This marked only the second time that a GT Academy driver would achieve a podium here, after Ordóñez had managed 2nd place just 2 years earlier. Now, fast forward a decade and we would see the release of the Gran Turismo movie. This film follows the story of Jan Mardenborough, from competing in GT Academy through to ending up on the podium at Le Mans. However, this film is somewhat notorious for taking creative liberties. For instance, depicting Jan as the first ever GT Academy winner and the first graduate to finish on the podium at Le Mans, despite the fact that both of those accolades actually go to Lucas Ordóñez, who was even one of his co-drivers in this race. But another important point is how the events of the film have been time-shifted into current day, by which I mean 2023. For example, Jan isn't playing Gran Turismo 5, he's playing Gran Turismo 7. And this also explains the change of car, as the Zytek Z11 SN has been swapped out for a Ligier JS PX. Now, this isn't technically an LMP2 car, rather it's a track day special that's heavily based on a newer LMP2, that being the JS P217. Regardless, neither the Ligier nor the Zytek are currently in GT7, which seems like a missed opportunity to me. The Ligier because it could have been a cool movie tie-in that's a lot more interesting than just the livery for the GTR GT3, and the Zytek because it represents a totally unique class of car, and one that holds a fascinating place in Gran Turismo history. In fact, by this point we pretty much know that some of the car models in GT7 are just enhanced PS3 models, and given that the Zytek was one of the last PS3 era car models ever created, transferring it into GT7 shouldn't take that much effort at all. Whether it be LMP2, Group C2, or any other lower category of prototypes throughout history, I've always felt like these types of cars represent a massive blind spot, not just in Gran Turismo, but other similar racing games too. If we look beyond merely the cream of the crop, there's a whole host of fascinating prototype race cars that many people have never even heard of, just waiting to get a spotlight shone on them. At the end of the day, it doesn't really surprise me that they get ignored in racing games, as to an extent, the same is true in real life. In 2024, with the hypercar and LMGT3 categories of the World Endurance Championship growing at an astounding rate, the decision was made to cut out the LMP2 class completely. Having been a staple of the series from its inception, it really was a shock decision, but also completely understandable. Despite the important role it serves, LMP2 has always been somewhat underloved. All of this is to say that, without the GT Academy connection, it's very likely we never would have seen the Zytek or any other car like it in Gran Turismo. And now that it's gone, we possibly won't ever again. The Suzuki Escudo Pikes Peak, Gillet Vertigo race car, Tommy Kyra's ZZ2, the list of obscure and unusual cars that have appeared in Gran Turismo is a lengthy one. These are the sorts of models that really make you think, I wonder how that ended up in the game. Through the course of my series of videos covering the many noteworthy machines found in these games, I've talked about a lot of them already. However, there are still a number that I've never touched. While some cars that were forgotten in real life gained a cult following thanks to Gran Turismo, there are plenty of others that didn't really catch on. So today, I thought it would be a good idea to focus specifically on some of these lesser known models that I've never really had a good reason to talk about before now. Because even though they're rarely discussed within the Gran Turismo community, many of these cars do have interesting stories to tell, both within the games and in real life. This selection includes not so illustrious racing machines, vehicles that were created for somewhat controversial purposes, and even a possible conspiracy. The name Toms is one that almost any Gran Turismo fan will instantly recognise. After all, they are responsible for quite possibly the single most recognisable car in the history of the franchise, the Castrol Tom Supra GT500. Founded back in 1974, Toms soon formed a strong relationship with Toyota, becoming an officially recognised tuning shop and racing team. Starting in Gran Turismo 2, we can find a handful of their tuning road cars, such as the Tom Supra and MR2-based T020. But they do have one model that stands alone as something totally unique. This is the Tom's Angel T01, the company's first and so far only original model. At first glance, this car kind of gives off a fictional vibe. Its somewhat generic styling, along with crazily stubby proportions, makes it feel like it was created just to be in the game. In my mind, I often lump it together with the Tomi Kaira ZZ3, another lightweight mid-engine Japanese sports car from the 90s that only appeared in GT2. Of course, as I've discussed in a previous video, although it was planned for production, the ZZ3 never existed in real life, and its inclusion in GT2 was just based on a handful of drawings. Where the Angel T01 differs is that it is very much real. Created to celebrate Tom's 20th anniversary, the chassis was penned by ex-Lotus Formula 1 designer Martin Ogilvy as a carbon fiber monocoque, just like an F1 car. But beyond this, almost everything else you can see on the car was taken from elsewhere, including the 1.6-litre engine from a Toyota Corolla with additional tuning. As you would expect, it's mostly Toyota parts, but interestingly, the windscreen comes from a Lancia Stratos. It also has custom gull-wing doors, because it just wasn't weird enough already. Performance-wise, whilst its roughly 160 horsepower isn't much, the whole car only weighs 700 kilos, meaning that it could easily keep up with the fastest sports cars of the day. Only a single example of the T01 was ever built, and it's currently owned by a private collector in Japan. So, whilst the odds of driving it in real life are pretty much zero, at least we still have GT2. To this day, the only racing game the T01 has ever appeared in. Like most cars from tuning companies in GT2, your only way to get it is to win it from an event. In this case, the first race of the Pure Sports Car Cup, where it can also appear as an opponent. But in spite of its extremely low weight, I don't think it feels as quick as it should. And although it can be upgraded, its performance ceiling isn't very high. It's worth noting that in demos of the game, there was also a silver color option. However, this was removed prior to release, most likely because the real car was always painted red. Unfortunately, like so many others from GT2, the Tom's Angel did not make the jump over to the PS2. In fact, neither did any of the other Tom's branded models. Gran Turismo 3 instead added the Tom's X540 Chaser, a car which is kind of interesting in its own way, given that the standard Toyota Chaser also never appeared in the series after the PS1 games. Of course, the Tom's name can be found in more recent titles on their various GT500 race cars, from the Supra to the Lexus SC430 and RCF. So, why isn't the Tom's Angel fondly remembered in the series? Well, to some degree it is, as whenever it gets brought up, most people who know of it only do so because of its appearance in GT2. But at the same time, I think that being exclusive to GT2 is a big part of the reason why it doesn't feel as special as it should do, as it was just kind of lost in the shuffle like so many others. And how it appears in the game isn't particularly memorable either. Sure, it is a prize car, but aside from that, there isn't a whole lot to talk about. As I said, its performance is nothing to write home about, with it being most useful for races with low horsepower limits. I also think that the PS1 visuals simply don't do it justice. I would have really loved to see it return in a more recent entry. When you put all of this together, it leads to a car which is inherently unique and interesting, but also kind of forgettable at the same time. In racing games like Gran Turismo, drifting has always been a small but dedicated niche within the community. But as far as official content goes, there isn't much to see. There was the drift handling option in the early games, and then the addition of Drift Trial with its own scoring system from the PS3 era onwards, which was used most often in the seasonal event challenges. When it comes to real-world drift cars, there have been a handful from series like D1 Grand Prix and Formula Drift. For the most part, these represent pretty well-known machines in the world of drifting, but that's not the case for all of them. The first game in the series to include real-world drift cars was Gran Turismo 4. Here we can find the 2004 HKS Genki Hyper Sylvia, which in real life was driven by Nobuteru Taniguchi, who finished second in D1 GP that year. This car is possibly one of the most recognizable competition drift cars ever, as not only does it look wild, it was also very successful and run by the legendary HKS outfits. The fact that Taniguchi himself has since gone on to become a racing legend, as well as a respected automotive journalist, I'm sure hasn't hurt its rep either. But within GT4, we can find a second D1 GP car, one that stands as almost the complete opposite of the Sylvia. Here is the car known in-game as the Mazda BP Falcon RX-7. This car was driven by Shingo Murao, who competed in the 2003 D1 GP season, finishing joint 27th with just 2 points. Unlike the HKS Sylvia, the real car is not particularly well remembered, so for most it doesn't hold much significance, beyond just being a tuned FC RX-7 making about 400 horsepower. Of course, this was the era when drift cars weren't as specialized as they are today, meaning that they could be used for grip driving with just some minor setup tweaks, and this is also true in GT4. In-game, the only way to get the car is by winning the Race of Turbo Sports event, meaning that you will encounter it in a full playthrough. Whether you decide to use it though is a different matter. Naturally, the car was carried through to the PS3 games, as a standard model of course, and like in GT4, it can occasionally be found as an opponent in events for tuned cars and even low-end race cars. Beyond that, there really isn't much else to say about its appearance in these games. At 200,000 credits, there's basically no reason to buy it, over just getting a base RX-7 and upgrading it yourself. One interesting note is that the name BP Falcon RX-7 was seemingly created just for the game, based on the car's primary sponsors. In case you're wondering, the Vigorous text that's most prominent is a line of high-performance engine oils created by BP. This naming quirk means that finding information on the real thing is even more difficult. If you search for it in Google, almost all of the results will be of the car in Gran Turismo. Funnily enough, finding footage of the car driving is actually a lot easier, as it can be seen in the D1 GP broadcasts from 2003, all of which you can watch on YouTube. I'll bet that for most of you, this is probably the first time you've ever seen the real version of this car in action. Or at least, that's what I would like to say. You see, I've not actually been telling you the whole truth. You might have noticed that the car in-game looks slightly different to the one you see here, most notably with the shape of its bumpers and rear wing. That's not an accident, because the car in Gran Turismo is actually modelled on Murao's other FC RX-7, which was built as both a backup for the D1 machine and also a street-legal version. It's a small but important detail that is actually referenced in the car's in-game description in GT5 and GT6. Finding information on his D1 car is already hard enough, but trying to look up this spare one is on another level. Outside of the game, the only evidence I was able to find of this car existing is a couple of images, an article detailing it in a Japanese magazine, and a single clip from when he used it in D1 at Odaiba in 2005, I believe. So, the obvious question to ask is, how did a car so obscure, but at the same time so unremarkable, end up in this game? Unfortunately, we don't know for certain, but my theory is that someone at Polyphony or Sony must have known Murao personally, or at the very least, he was invited to one of the GT4 filming days and brought this car with him. This idea is also somewhat supported by the car's internal name being Murao RX-7, as they normally reference the car's title sponsor, just like in-game, rather than the driver. As I said, the D1 machine wasn't at all successful, and the car fundamentally isn't that interesting. In fact, one of the only notable things about it is that it's a reverse import, evidenced by it being left-hand drive. This is something that I only realised after reading the car's in-game description. The fact that Gran Turismo itself is one of the best sources of information on this car that I can find kind of says it all. Previously in this series, I talked about the Lexus IS200 GT1 race car, itself a very obscure machine. It debuted in GT4, but was exclusive to the Korean version of the game. For the rest of us, when talking about a lesser-known Korean car from GT4, there will likely be one name that comes to mind: the Proto Motors Spira. This car was an attempt to design and build the country's first ever supercar. Powered by a Ford-derived V8, the same one from the Mustang SVT Cobra, the model we see here is the 2004 prototype, although interestingly, the game considers it a full production car. This is quite beneficial, as GT4 has a habit of restricting you from using concept cars in many events, and it also means that the Spira can simply be bought from the dealership for 80,000 credits. The car was something of a late addition to GT4, as it doesn't appear in the original Japanese release of the game, but you can find it everywhere else. Performance-wise, it's a very solid sports car, but it does lack the power to compete with the crop of new Western supercars in the game, like the Celine S7 and Ford GT. With upgrades though, it can be a solid budget option for the Supercar Festival events, where you can even find it as an opponent. In 2007, Proto Motors was bought by Ulim Motors, resulting in the car being retroactively rebranded for its subsequent appearances in GT5 and GT6. Despite being known almost exclusively from Gran Turismo, and also Forza Motorsport 2, where the 2006 prototype appears, this is a case where the car's story in real life goes a lot deeper than you might expect. Proto Motors was formed back in 1994 and soon established themselves as makers of bespoke vehicles, such as limousines, based on existing models from the likes of Kia and Hyundai. In 2001, they unveiled the PS2 concept car, the brainchild of Han Cheol Kim, the company's CEO. The car attracted a lot of attention in Korea, as a proper homegrown sports car had never been done before. Over the next few years, the concept evolved and gained a new name: Spira. This 2004 version with the Ford V8 is the one we all know from Gran Turismo, but they did plan to sell less powerful 6- and 4-cylinder options as well. Plans were put in place for a limited production run, but a lack of funds stalled proceedings. By 2006, not a single production Spira had been finished, and there were major doubts over the project. It was at this point that Ulim Motors enters the picture, a new company founded by car enthusiast Dong Hyuk Park. The following year, they agreed to a joint venture, with the business rights of the project being transferred to Ulim Motors. To help with development and also maintain public interest, the Spira was turned into a race car and entered into the domestic GT Masters series. Under the banner of Ulim Racing, the Spira competed in the 2008 season and finished 5th in the GT class, against rivals like the Nissan 350Z, Porsche 911, and BMW M3. Work on the production Spira continued in the background, and the car was finally launched in March of 2010. It now sported a range of Hyundai V6 engines, the most powerful making around 500 horsepower. In the years after, various different versions of the Spira would be showcased. There was the Spira Cregit with updated styling, an EV model developed jointly with a Dutch company, and even a stretched limousine version called the Bengali. In 2016, the company was renamed to Spira EV, and renders of a second-generation Spira were shown off. In spite of their high ambitions, Ulim Networks, the parent company of Ulim Motors, was in financial trouble, and there wouldn't be much news over the next few years. But in 2023, the Ulim Motors name re-emerged. Work on the second-generation Spira resumed, with new renders being shown off for what they were now calling the Spira Rinascita, meaning revival or resurrection in Italian. It was planned to be an all-electric supercar, but work on it was put on hold at the end of 2023. Instead, they decided to focus on something that would be easier to produce in the short term. In 2024, they unveiled a new model, the Spira Cregit 24, or SC24 for short. This car is partially based on the first-generation Spira, but now with a range of 4-cylinder turbocharged engines. Orders have been taken for the car, although there are once again doubts over whether it will actually make it into production. As you can see, the story of the Spira far exceeds just the car we know from Gran Turismo. There have been plenty of similar startup car companies that we've seen in racing games, but they almost always meet the same fate, either collapsing before they can put their car into production, or just making a handful of cars before quietly fading away. But the Spira is different. Even though its story isn't widely covered outside of its home country, its legacy extends much further than I ever realized. To be honest, I've just barely scratched the surface here. From the many controversies of the man in charge, to the original prototype being left abandoned in a random village for almost a decade, and plenty more. It's one hell of a rabbit hole to accidentally stumble into. Wow, Gran Turismo sure has been adding a lot of weird cars lately, is a phrase that you've likely heard before. And people do have a point. From the Toyota Ambulance, to the Suzuki K-Truck, and whatever the latest Vision GT is by the time this video comes out, Polyphony seem obsessed with these novelty vehicles that aren't included with any specific gameplay purpose, other than to be quirky and different. However, we can't pretend that this is a recent development. Cars that can't really be used for much in the game have been part of this series in some form for a while now. But if you were to try and pinpoint what is the most unsuitable car to have ever appeared in these games, I've got a couple of often overlooked candidates. Gran Turismo 5 saw the inclusion of 2 new classic vehicles from Volkswagen, but they probably weren't what most people were expecting. First up, we have the Kubelwagen military vehicle. Now, you don't need me to tell you that performance isn't what it was designed for, and with just 23 horsepower, it isn't going anywhere fast. No, this car was mainly included for its historical significance, much like the Ford Model T or classic Benzes in GT4. The Kubelwagen was designed by Dr. Ferdinand Porsche under orders from the German military, and from all accounts, it served its purpose well. Of course, that purpose was to mobilize the German military in World War II, and its, less than savory regime. But hey, that isn't the car's fault. Now if you thought that the scintillating speed of the Kubelwagen was just a little bit too much to handle, don't worry, because Polyphony has you covered. This is the Schwimmwagen, and as well as having an amazing name, its other claim to fame is that it's so far the only amphibious vehicle to ever appear in the series. It has a 4x4 system that makes it better off-road, but at the cost of almost an extra 200 kilos over the Kubelwagen, so performance is sluggish to say the least. In fact, it's the vehicle that can claim to have the lowest performance point rating in the PS3 games. Also designed by Ferdinand Porsche, a fun fact is that 1,300 of the roughly 14,000 Schwimmwagens produced were actually built by Porsche instead of VW, but the one included here is a Volkswagen. In-game, it has some really neat details, like the propeller on the back, and my personal favourite, oars for steering in water. Now, like most of these quirky and unusual vehicles, there isn't a whole lot you can actually do with them in the game. However, they do get a spotlight shone on them in the memorable, iconic, and dare I say legendary, Top Gear Test Track special event. The final advanced stage has you racing a Kubelwagen, but with a separate pack of Schwimmwagens half a lap behind. As the track crosses over itself, collisions are inevitable and hilarity ensues. At least, I think that was the idea. In reality, it kind of just makes the race a bit easier as some of your rivals get taken out. Aside from this, these two cars don't really do a whole lot, but the Kubelwagen can be won from the A-Spec Euro Classic Car events. One plus point is that these cars can be upgraded like any other, and for the Kubelwagen in particular, this means that it can actually be used to win some early game races. I don't know why you'd want to do this, but the point is that you can. These two cars would of course reappear in GT6, where they're even less relevant, and that's where their stories end. In GT7, we instead have a US counterpart, the Willys Jeep, which at least keeps the World War II spirit going. Once again, these were two quite unusual vehicles to see in a racing game, but I don't hear people talking about them very often. What I think is important to remember is that when GT4 included the Model T and Benzes, that was pretty much the first time something like that had been done in a major racing game. To not only see these cars be modelled for a mainstream video game, but even be drivable, was extremely novel and kind of cool, even if the cars themselves were functionally useless. The VWs just never really had the same impact, as they ended up being overshadowed by many other things in GT5. I think a parallel can be drawn with the Vision GT cars. We remember the Nike 1, and to a lesser extent GT by Citroën, mainly because the idea of a company collaborating with Gran Turismo to design a car specifically for the game was such a wild concept back then. But with the proliferation of Vision GT, it just doesn't have the same impact anymore. And ultimately, when cars like these can't be used for much in the game, either by their very nature or through limitations imposed on them, that wow factor is what really determines whether or not we remember them. Unfortunately, these VWs were just too understated for that to be the case. And even if they get brought back to the series someday, I don't think that's gonna change. Here's an interesting thought experiment. Try to think of a car that's never been in Gran Turismo, but feels like it already has. I'm sure many of you have different answers, which I'd love to hear in the comments by the way. But whenever I think about this, there's always one car that comes to my mind straight away: the Mitsubishi Starion. When you really consider it, I don't think it's hard to see why. The Starion was part of the crop of 80s Japanese sports cars like the Mazda RX-7, Toyota Supra, and Nissan 300ZX, all models that have had a very solid presence in the series. And beyond that, it just seems like one of those cars that should have appeared in the games at least once, even if it was a one and done deal, like the first gen RX-7 in GT2 for example. Whilst it isn't a super common sight in racing games, the Starion has made a few notable appearances, including in GT's longtime rival, Forza Motorsport. But somehow, through nearing 3 decades, the Starion just never made the cut for Gran Turismo. Of course, the real car also has a decent legacy within racing, winning various endurance races and touring car events throughout the 80s. But when we think of Mitsubishi in motorsports, we naturally think of their rallying dynasty, and the Starion also played a crucial role in that. Although the Starion road car has never appeared in a GT game, that's not to say that a Starion of some variety hasn't. Starting with GT4, we can find the Starion 4-wheel drive rally car. One niche that GT4 really expanded on was the selection of Group B rally machines. From the Lancia Delta S4 and Ford RS200, which returned from GT2, we also saw the inclusion of the Peugeot 205 T16, Renault 5 Turbo, and less well-remembered Nissan 240 RS, which was a contender at the Safari Rally. However, this Starion is easily the most obscure of the bunch. Performance-wise, it's by no means slow, pushing out around 360 horsepower. However, in a similar vein to the Lister Storm V12 race car, they incorrectly gave it the weight of the Starion road car, 1,250 kilos, opposed to the 1,000 kilos that it actually was. This error would plague it in all of its subsequent appearances too. In-game, you can only get it from beating the Grand Canyon Rally on hard difficulty, hands down one of the hardest special conditions events. But even if you never owned it, there's still a decent chance that you drove it in the 10th Super License test, a 1-lap time trial at Grand Canyon. Considering all of that, my choice of circuit for the background footage is pretty obvious. Returning in GT5 and GT6, the car would firmly fade into the background, partially thanks to being priced similarly to other Group B cars that had far better performance. So, what exactly is the deal with this Starion rally car, and why don't you know much about its real-life history? Well, with the sudden emergence of turbocharging and all-wheel drive systems in rallying, Mitsubishi decided that they wanted to join the party. In 1983, they launched their Starion rear-wheel drive sports car, and within the year had built a prototype Group B rally version. This car took strong inspiration from the Audi Quattro that pioneered the technology, but with a focus on not making it as front-heavy. The car was tested and developed throughout 1984, including a run at the Mille Pistes Rally, a round of the French Championship. As it had yet to be homologated, it was entered in the prototype category and went on to finish the event. It also competed in the RAC Rally at the end of the year, as well as the Malaysian Rally in 1985. The original plan was for the car to take on a full assault of the WRC in 1985, but this ended up being delayed as Mitsubishi continued to work on it. By the time it was finally ready to be homologated in the middle of 1986, for a prospective WRC challenge the following year, it had been decided to outlaw Group B at the end of the season following a number of fatal accidents. After this, the car only raced on a handful more occasions, most notably at the Hong Kong to Beijing Rally, which still allowed prototype vehicles. Entered under the guise of Team Mitsubishi China, it would finish second overall in 1986, but retired in 1987. The car was then pulled from competition and became part of Mitsubishi's Heritage Collection. Interestingly, the yellow livery with dark blue and gold stripes that we all know from Gran Turismo, and which the real car has been maintained in, is the 555 colour scheme that it ran only at the Hong Kong to Beijing Rally, and is not unique to the Starion. Here's an Audi Quattro from the 1986 event with an almost identical design. I find it kind of strange that they decided not to revert it back to their factory colours, but at least it makes the car stand out among their other race and rally machines. The Mitsubishi Starion is somewhat infamous for being a phantom Group B car. It was built to Group B regs, but at the same time it was never officially homologated, meaning that it never actually competed in the Group B category. Part of the reason for this is that Mitsubishi never built any of the required 200 road-going versions, but official renders of a supposed road car were revealed in 2021, almost 4 decades after it was first planned. As we've discussed, unusual and obscure cars like this are a mainstay of the Gran Turismo series. But what's strange about this case is that they were actually beaten to the punch. Rival title Sega GT 2002 included the Starion 4-wheel drive in all of its glory, and it would go on to reappear in pseudo-sequel Sega GT Online in 2004. 2003's Kaido Racer, known in the West as Tokyo Extreme Racer Drift, also included the Starion 4-wheel drive, as did its sequel the following year. However, it is worth noting that in all of these games, the Starion 4-wheel drive appears alongside its regular road car counterparts, something that's never happened in Gran Turismo. So, was my point earlier incorrect, and the Starion has actually appeared in a Gran Turismo game? That really depends on how much you consider this Group B version to be a Starion. Personally, even though it is based on one, I think that this car has to be considered as its own distinct thing. In fact, visually it doesn't even look much like a Starion anymore. The front end in particular is completely different. These factors, along with the presence of far more well-known and simply better Group B machines, means that the Starion 4-wheel drive was never going to be especially popular in these games. However, it does at least have the distinction of being possibly the most obscure and forgotten real-world factory rally car to ever appear in the series. The German Touring Car Championship, better known as DTM, has a somewhat patchy history in Gran Turismo. Cars from the series have appeared in these games as far back as the second entry, but until recently they had all but disappeared. It wasn't until Gran Turismo 7's update 1.31 that a new DTM machine was included, the 2019 Audi RS5. In fact, discounting the series' current GT3 era, the most recent DTM car before this one dates all the way back to 2008. However, the car in question is unique because it never actually competed in the DTM. This is the Lexus ISF Racing Concept, a Lexus ISF built to the DTM rule set of the time. This car debuted in GT5 and was essentially a proof of concept for what a DTM ISF could look like. However, it's stated that its primary purpose was for engineers to sample true driving pleasure, as Toyota put it, and assist them in development of the road-going ISF. Either way, in-game it performs how you'd expect a DTM car of this era to perform. It makes over 500 horsepower, and its high levels of downforce lead to a stable driving experience, making it a very solid mid-tier race car. In GT5, you'll find the German Touring Car event which returns from the previous games, and the ISF can actually be used in it. And you would have good reason to, as it's the only eligible car that can be bought at any time from the new car dealership. On a side note, this event also allows the Audi R8 LMS and BMW M3 GTR to enter, despite neither racing in the DTM and not even being built to DTM standards. When the ISF returned in GT6, it was one of the 25 cars selected to get a special 15th anniversary livery, and one of only 3 that weren't either brand new cars or ones that were remade as premium models for the game. Sadly, there is no DTM-style event in GT6, but with its price reduced to less than half of what it was in GT5, it still represents a decent option in this game. So, I mentioned that this car never actually raced in the DTM, nor was it ever meant to. But is that really true? After all, the ISF was designed as a premium sports saloon to rival those from the likes of Mercedes and Audi. In that respect, racing the ISF in the DTM against its German competitors would have made a lot of sense. It's very possible that Toyota did seriously consider it, but simply changed their mind later on. Adding further fuel to this fire is that it was reported on Touring Car Times that Toyota had purchased an ex-DTM Opel Vectra, which they could use to help with developing their own car. But if you believe certain other sources, this detail goes a bit deeper. There has been a theory dating all the way back to 2008 that this car is not an original model developed and built by Toyota, but rather just a rebodied Opel Vectra DTM. For many people, Toyota's reluctance to disclose many technical details about the car is a major red flag. The ISF also shares a number of features with the Vectra, such as a Bosch Motronic ECU, AP racing brakes, and an identical wheelbase. That first point is something that was only noticed thanks to the car's recreation in Gran Turismo, in fact. So, case closed. Toyota put an Opel in some new clothes and tried to pass it off as their own work. But on the other hand, we can't say that for certain, because some of the facts that appear as a smoking gun can be easily explained. For example, the Bosch ECU and AP racing brakes were both spec parts in the DTM, so the car would have had them anyway even if it was designed from the ground up. Also, the similarities in terms of proportions are to be expected, given that the DTM regulations were quite prescriptive. Under those conditions, they can only make the cars look so different. When it comes to the engine, if you follow the Opel theory, then you'll believe that it too was carried over from the Vectra. However, there was some speculation that this was changed to a Toyota 3UZ FE, the same unit fitted to their SC430s in Super GT at the time. Because there was never any official statements, we simply don't know what engine it had, other than that it was a V8 and made around 500 horsepower. Although, if Toyota had tried to simply rebadge the Opel engine, that wouldn't have been unheard of in the DTM. At this point, Audi were using a rebranded Mugen Honda V8 in their A4 DTM, an engine that had previously been used in Formula 3000 and Formula Nippon. According to Yukihiko Yaguchi, the designer of the ISF road car and the person whose name appeared on the racing concept when it was first seen, the car had its first shakedown at Paul Ricard back in 2006, well over a year before it was officially unveiled at the Tokyo Auto Salon in January 2008. If this is indeed true, this means that the car was built during the development of the ISF road car, which itself wasn't shown publicly until the start of 2007. It also means that the car being listed as a 2008 model year is technically incorrect, as it existed well before that, but just wasn't publicly known about. Anyway, after the 2006 test, there's a bit of a void in the car's timeline, time Toyota possibly spent evaluating a full DTM entry, until it was revealed in early 2008 as effectively just a development tool. The car was then exhibited across Japan, including at the 2010 Toyota Motorsports Festival at Fuji Speedway, where it was even done up to look like a safety car. But to this day, the mystery of what exactly this car is still remains. I really wonder if the people who are responsible for getting the car into the game know any more about it than we do. After all, they would have needed to get a lot of data to be able to recreate it to their standards, and so they would have been some of the only people outside of Toyota to ever get fully hands-on with it. In case you're wondering, Lexus did eventually compete in the DTM, but not with the ISF. Starting in 2014, Super GT and DTM began converging their regulations under the unified Class 1 moniker. Thanks to this, in 2019, a handful of GT500 cars were invited to take part in the DTM season finale at Hockenheim, and this included a Lexus LC500. In return, a number of DTM cars then competed against the Super GT machines in a couple of exhibition races at Fuji Speedway. Gran Turismo really has a habit of including Toyota race cars that you just wouldn't expect them to. From the Minolta 88 CV, which achieved nothing, to their ill-fated Turbo 7 murder machine, and then the ISF racing concept, the car that Toyota was so proud to show off, including in virtual form, but for some reason don't ever want to talk about. We're back with another installment of memorable cars in Gran Turismo. You know, over the past few years, I've covered a lot of strange and fascinating machines throughout this series, so it's honestly kind of amazing that there are still many that I've yet to talk about. The theme of today's video is cars that hold a unique place within Gran Turismo history. Effectively, we're not just looking at cars that are quirky and interesting, but cars that are quirky and interesting in ways like no other car that's ever appeared in this series. This can be through their inherent characteristics and features, or even specific ways in which they were implemented into the games. We've got an eclectic mix of models to get through, so let's dive in. Our first example takes us to Gran Turismo 2, always fertile ground when it comes to intriguing vehicles. There are plenty of cars in this game that never reappeared in any future titles, ranging from ordinary commuters to high-performance monsters. Generally, the cars in the latter group are pretty well remembered, but there is one that I don't think gets talked about very often. The Suzuki Cultus Pikes Peak version is a special model that you can only find in GT2. As the name implies, this car was designed to race at the Pikes Peak International Hill Climb, with a shortened version of said course also making its one and only appearance in this game. Now, for anyone who's played GT2, the reason why the Cultus gets somewhat forgotten is pretty obvious. This car was succeeded by the Suzuki Escudo Pikes Peak version, a model which also debuted in GT2, and just so happens to be the de facto fastest car in the entire game. Its legendary status was further cemented by future appearances in the PS2 and PS3 games, and it was even brought back to the series in super high fidelity with Gran Turismo 7. Saying all this, it's easy to see why the Cultus isn't as fondly remembered. In GT2, it's effectively just a less extreme version of the Escudo. Whilst it does have some pretty radical aero, it just doesn't look as aggressive as its younger brother, and performance-wise it's also noticeably slower. But despite this, it still costs the same amount, 2 million credits, and there's no way to win it as a prize car either. When you put all of this together, there is basically no reason to ever use this car over the Escudo. In fact, until I started work on this video, I had never even driven it before, and I think that most GT2 players are in the same boat. However, as per the theme of this video, there is one detail that sets this car apart from not just the Escudo, but every other car that's ever appeared in this series. This detail relates to its engine, or should I say, engines. Yes, in real life, this car is a twin-engine design, having a turbocharged 1.6-litre unit in the front, and another in the back. This setup is totally unparalleled when it comes to cars in Gran Turismo. The Escudo, for instance, employs a single twin-turbo V6 to make its power. Of course, the Pikes Peak Cultus is not the only twin-engine car to ever exist in real life. Another notable example is the Mark II Volkswagen Golf that also raced at Pikes Peak a handful of times in the 80s. This layout is very useful when trying to maximize power within a compact body. When combined, the Cultus's two engines make about 800 horsepower, roughly 200 less than the Escudo, but still pretty damn impressive. Each engine powers one of the axles, making it four-wheel drive, and as it weighs less than 900 kilos, acceleration is rapid, certainly better than any of the non-hill climb cars in this game. In the corners, it is definitely more prone to understeer than the mid-engine Escudo, but the bottom line is that it's still good enough to win every single race that it's eligible for in the career. Well, with the exception of the final Pikes Peak hill climb race against the Escudo. It is technically still possible with a skilled driver, but this head-to-head really highlights the car's disadvantages. Interestingly, the theme of this car being unfairly overshadowed extends to its real-life story. The twin-engine Cultus first appeared at the mountain in 1989, with Nobuhiro Monster Tajima at the wheel, and just 4 years later, it had evolved into the bewinged beast that we all know from GT2. At that point, the overall record at Pikes Peak was held by Ari Vatanen, which he set in a Peugeot 405 T16 in 1988, a run that was made famous by the Climb Dance film. And in 1993, who became the first person to beat Vatanen's legendary run? Well, none other than Monster Tajima and his twin-engine Cultus, with a time of 10 minutes and 44.22 seconds. However, this new record would only stand for a matter of minutes, as it was just beaten by a car in the open-wheel division. Ultimately, Tajima and Suzuki would have to wait a couple more years for their first overall victory at the mountain, but the fact remains that for the briefest period, this Cultus was a Pikes Peak record holder, even if the record book itself doesn't show it. In some ways, I do wonder what might have happened had the Cultus been the only Pikes Peak special that appeared in GT2. Would it be held in the same regard as its red replacement currently is? I kinda doubt it. After all, whilst it is still one of the fastest cars in GT2, it just doesn't have the same game-breaking speed as the Escudo. However, in that scenario, I still think that the Cultus would get more recognition than it currently does. I mean, did you even know that this car had two engines before I mentioned it? There's a decent chance that you didn't, such as the degree to which this model has been put in the shade. But hey, cars like the Pikes Peak Cultus are the exact reason why I love making videos like these. When it comes to records within Gran Turismo, such as the car with the most power or the highest top speed, it feels like we're far from reaching the ceiling of what's possible. This is in part thanks to the fictional concept cars of Vision Gran Turismo, but also the ever-expanding potential of real-world electric vehicles. However, there is one record in this series that I'm confident will never be broken. First appearing in Gran Turismo 4, this is the Jay Leno tank car, a custom-built hot rod sporting an engine taken from an M47 Patton tank. This almost 30-litre V12 is the biggest engine fitted to any vehicle found in these games, and the tank car itself is also the longest and heaviest car in the entire series. Unsurprisingly, this car is considered a special vehicle in GT4, and so can't be used in any single-player races. There are a couple of interesting details regarding this car's inclusion. For example, its name. Jay Leno is of course a famous US TV personality and avid car collector, and tank car obviously refers to where its engine came from. However, the official name of this car in real life is the Blasterline Special, as christened by its creator, Randy Grubb. Originally built in 2001, the car was sold to Jay Leno a couple of years later, who then performed some modifications. As he's mentioned before in interviews, the inclusion of this car in GT4 was kind of incidental. Apparently, the Gran Turismo team visited his garage to record some engine sounds, but when they saw the tank car, they were so fascinated by it that they decided to include it in the game as well. As such, the version in GT4 is the upgraded 2003 spec, and I guess that's why in-game it appears under the Jay Leno brand, with no mention of its actual name. As for how it drives, it's honestly a lot better than you might expect. It's not exactly nimble, but when driving in bumper cam, I find that it's easy to forget that it weighs 3.5 tons. In some ways, I think that GT4's twitchy handling model actually helps it. The immense power and torque can cause excessive wheel spin, but overall, I'd say its performance is comparable to an entry-level sports car, if not better. As well as having the biggest car in the series, GT4 also features the narrowest circuits, Città d'Aria. Really, if you haven't tried to thread the tank car through these twisty Italian streets, I recommend giving it a go. It's an experience unlike anything else in Gran Turismo. The tank car would reappear in the PS3 games, where it can be used much more freely. In GT5, you get it as a prize car for completing the A-Spec American Championship, so most players will end up with it in their garage at some point. Although there are no special vehicle limitations in this game, the tank car is still very much a novelty. Performance point wise, it's quite overrated, meaning that in arcade mode, it gets matched up with high-end sports cars and supercars that it simply can't keep up with. Still, it's a lot of fun to mess around with, which is what most people ended up doing with it anyway. Beyond 2003, the real car was further upgraded with twin turbochargers, and is said to make around 1600 horsepower. Sadly, this was never reflected in Gran Turismo. If it were, this would have made it the most powerful car in GT4 and GT5, being even more potent than the Red Bull X cars. The tank car is one of those true oddities in Gran Turismo. There is nothing else even remotely like it in these games. Not only can it not be used in single-player races in GT4, it can't even enter certain photo travel locations due to its size. And also because of that, in GT5, its oil change animation looks like this. The tank car stands as a monument to doing something not because it's easy or because it makes sense, but simply because you can. That mantra applies to not only its creation in real life, but also how it ended up in Gran Turismo at all. There are many cars in this series that we can look at and say they deserve better. Whether they were cars that were underutilized, cars that were overshadowed by other models like we've already seen, or simply cars that were left in the series past. In most cases, these are the result of specific design choices by Polyphony, but there is one example where things were completely out of their hands. Gran Turismo for the PSP is a game that I rarely talk about on this channel, mainly because it isn't very relevant to the topics I usually cover. That said, it did introduce a few new cars, such as the Ferrari Enzo and Bugatti Veyron. Another new addition was this, the Mazda Furai concept. Built on the chassis of a Courage LMP2 car, the Furai was part of a design study for Mazda's future road cars. It was powered by a highly tuned R20B 3-rotor engine making around 450 horsepower, and when combined with its low curb weight of just 675 kilograms, made it quite a track weapon, both in the game and in real life. Fast forward to Gran Turismo 5 the following year and the Furai would return. However, it wasn't made into a PS3 spec premium model, but rather retained its less detailed PSP form. Now this phenomenon wasn't exclusive to the Furai. Various cars that debuted in GT PSP, including the Veyron, were not updated for GT5. Even so, it was still a shame to see a car as beautiful as this one be rendered to a lower standard. In-game, the performance of the Furai is still very impressive. It can easily hold its own against prototypes that have almost twice as much power. As well as the lottery that is the used car dealership, you can get this car by winning the B-Spec Roadster Cup event. This means that if you decide to do B-Spec first, you can use this car to completely break the game. The Roadster Cup is a level 6 event, but the Furai is a level 23 car. You don't need to work out the maths on that one. In real life, after being unveiled in 2008 with much fanfare, the Furai disappeared from public view shortly after. Well, in September 2013, it was revealed that the real car had been destroyed when its engine caught fire during a photo shoot for Top Gear magazine. All that was left were these charred remains that were collected by Mazda, the fate of which in current day is still unknown. Later in 2013, Gran Turismo 6 came out, and whilst a number of PSP carryovers, like the Veyron, were remade with full premium models, the Furai was unsurprisingly not one of them. The real-life incident which claimed the car took place in August 2008, but its first appearance in Gran Turismo PSP didn't come until well over a year later. As far as I can tell, this makes it the only car in this series to be modelled for one of these games, but then have its sole example destroyed in real life before it actually appeared. Of course, Gran Turismo isn't alone in this respect, as the Furai was featured in a few other racing games shortly after its death, notably Race Driver Grid and Forza Motorsport 3, included as DLC in both cases. As these were console titles, this meant that the car was modelled to a much higher standard for them, including a full cockpit view. Gran Turismo, meanwhile, was stuck with their low-res PSP model, and as the real car was now just a pile of ashes, there wasn't much they could do about it. Another difference in terms of its appearance in these games is the paint. This car is available in 12 different colours, 11 of which being fictional paints with a Gran Turismo prefix. The unnamed first option reflects the car's real colour scheme, satin black with red accents. However, even this isn't totally accurate, as it's missing its basic livery as well as sponsor decals. I'm not entirely sure why this is the case, since most other games where it appears include these with no issues. As a result of the car's popularity, the Furai has continued to feature in racing games, most recently the Forza Motorsport reboot by way of a DLC pack in May of 2025. But as far as Gran Turismo is concerned, this car has been MIA ever since GT6. You have to wonder, if the Furai had gotten a premium model back on the PS3, would we still have it in the series in current day? I think that it's entirely possible. The fact that it no longer really exists means that modelling it from scratch to the standards which we now expect from this series seems unlikely. However, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. In the PS3 games, we also saw the Isuzu 4200R. This was a long-forgotten concept car that in real life had been destroyed almost 2 decades prior, albeit intentionally. Using reference images, as well as guidance from one of the car's original designers, the 4200R was meticulously modelled and effectively brought back to life through Gran Turismo. It's a really interesting story, one that I've covered in more detail in a previous video. But my point is that I don't see why the same process couldn't also be used on the Furai one day. It may be a long shot, but if there was ever another extinct concept car worthy of this treatment, I think that it should be this one. The Mazda Furai captured people's hearts and minds in a way that most other concept cars could only dream of. It's a really unique thing, and so the fact that it holds a unique place within Gran Turismo history only adds to its mystique. When it comes to showcasing the history of automobiles, Gran Turismo 4 is still the game that does this the best. GT4 includes cars from almost every era, dating back to the very first pre-war designs. Understandably, pretty much all of the models from before the 1950s are, well, slow. Most aren't even allowed in any single-player races, and so the experience of driving them is just supposed to be a quirky novelty. There is, however, one major exception. The 1937 Auto Union V16 Type C Streamline is very clearly different to the other vintage machines in this game. Based on a Grand Prix car from the era, this is a streamlined vehicle, the only one to ever appear in this series. It was built to do one thing and one thing only: go fast in a straight line. This is one of the few cars in GT4 that was added late, as it doesn't appear in the original Japanese version of the game. Everywhere else, you can either win it from the Grand Valley 300km endurance race, or buy it from the Audi Legends dealership for 500,000 credits. Interestingly, in the files of the game, you can find leftovers for an Auto Union dealership that was never used. Auto Union is the forerunner to Audi, hence why the car is considered an Audi in the final game. Whilst the real car was capable of almost 300 miles per hour, in-game you'll be lucky to crack 220, which is a bit disappointing. Furthermore, this car is also considered a special vehicle and so cannot be used in single-player races. In fact, it goes even further than that, as unlike any other special vehicle in GT4, this one has additional restrictions. It can only be driven in the power and speed mode, aka machine test, as well as on the Nürburgring Nordschleife. Side note, through my research, I found claims that this car is not considered a special vehicle on the NTSCU Greatest Hits version of GT4 specifically. I wasn't able to test this myself, but if you've played this version of the game, please let me know if this is actually true. Anyway, as the Nordschleife is the only road circuit where you can drive this thing, you will very quickly discover its unique handling traits. Being a streamlined design with wheel covers all around, naturally the front wheels don't have a huge steering angle. But in spite of this, the car can make it around corners no problem. How is this possible? Well, whilst the steering wheel may just be a suggestion, the fact that the car is so rear heavy means that a small steering input is enough to get the car to rotate around the turn through just inertia. It certainly isn't easy to control, but once you get a handle on how it works, it is possible to tame this beast. Although, be aware that because of this, counter-steering does next to nothing, so if you get into a slide, there isn't much that you can do. From reports, the tricky handling is pretty accurate to the real thing. However, what isn't so accurate is the fact that in-game, the car is listed as naturally aspirated. In real life, it was actually supercharged. In fact, this car is overall a bit of an imposter. Whilst it's listed as the 1937 Type C Streamline, the in-game model appears to be based on a replica that was commissioned by Audi in the year 2000, and currently resides in their heritage collection. The reason why they didn't use the original car is that, in keeping with our previous entry, it no longer exists. The real Type C Streamline was infamously destroyed during a top speed run in 1938. When travelling at close to 300 miles per hour, it was hit by a gust of wind and flipped over, with driver Bernd Rossemeyer being killed in the ensuing crash. In that sense, the Streamliner shares a trait with the Toyota 7, another car that ended up killing its driver in real life. The Auto Union was planned to return in future entries, namely GT-PSP, where its name can be found in an unused text string, and also GT5, where it's referenced as an opponent in the Cut Real Circuit Tours event. But in both cases, it didn't appear for unknown reasons. It would however get one more outing in Gran Turismo 6. Here the car's unique handling traits are once again on full display. In fact, I think it's even trickier to drive in this game than it was in GT4. It almost feels like it has rear wheel steering. Here's a fun fact: with the absence of the Ford Model T, Daimler Motor Carriage and Benz Patent Motorwagen, the Type C is actually the oldest car in GT6. Well, that's only if you take it as being the original car from 1937, like the game does, and not the 2000 replica. We can now also freely use this car on tracks besides the Nürburgring, as well as in single-player races. As a streamliner, the Like the Wind event at Special Stage Route X is where it feels most at home. And with a turbo kit to add some oomph, as well as a bit of slipstream assistance, this car can finally achieve what it never managed to in real life, and break the 300 miles per hour barrier. It may not have had such a happy ending in reality, but that's a nice way to send it off. Gran Turismo is no stranger to licensing complications. Whether it be the GT500 Diablo that debuted in GT3, but only in the Japanese version of the game, or their ongoing dispute with Lotus. Back when GT6 was about to come out, one car that was due to be included in it was this, the Nissan Delta Wing. Originally starting out as an IndyCar concept, the Delta Wing would eventually race at the Le Mans 24 Hours in 2012, under Garage 56 as an experimental car. The Delta Wing had already been seen in screenshots, trailers, and even playable demos for the game, but just a month before GT6 was due to release, it mysteriously disappeared from the official car list. In 2013, Nissan decided to end their involvement with the Delta Wing, which they were the main backers of at Le Mans in 2012. Hence why it was called the Nissan Delta Wing. But at the same time, they managed to poach the car's original designer, Ben Bowlby, who they employed to design a new car to race at Le Mans. The end result was known as the Nissan Ziod RC, and its similarities to the Delta Wing were obvious. In the meantime, the original Delta Wing, now with a new Mazda-based engine, was still racing in the American Le Mans series. The Delta Wing IP was owned by Don Panos, who also happened to be the founder of the ALMS. When he learned about the Nissan Ziod, he wasn't too happy, feeling that his copyright of the Delta Wing had been infringed. As a result, he started legal proceedings against Nissan and Bowlby, and this all just so happened to take place in November of 2013. Needless to say, the Delta Wing's inclusion in GT6 was in major doubt because of this, but there was a positive resolution. Just a few days before GT6 was due to release, the official car list was once again updated, adding back the 2012 Delta Wing, but also the 2013 ALMS version. Both of these cars appeared with the Day 1 update, being listed under the Delta Wing brand. The car that was formerly known as the Nissan Deltawing had been renamed to the Deltawing sponsored by Nissan at Le Mans 2012. This awkward name was no doubt a result of the ongoing legal case, but the fact that it appeared in the game at all was a minor miracle. In fact, the intro to the game originally included a scene with the Nissan-sponsored car, which was then replaced with the 2013 version, even though the former was still in the game. I think this gives us some insight into how close they were to cutting the 2012 car entirely. So that's the backstory, but what are these cars like in the game? Well, both of them are ranked very highly in the performance point ratings. The more powerful 2013 version is even comparable to some Group C prototypes. However, driving it is a different matter. Back when I played this game for the first time, I remember being really disappointed with the Deltawing, and I have to say that 12 years later, nothing has really changed. I find this car very snappy and uncontrollable in low-speed corners, but then very unresponsive and understeery in high-speed ones. It's so bad that at Daytona, you can't even go around the banking at full throttle. Now, I'm sure that tuning could help with these problems, but it won't solve them entirely. Reportedly, the real car required a unique driving style. I guess that's to be expected with such an unusual design. And there are people out there who swear by this car in GT6. However, I can't crack it in the same way that I could with the Auto Union. It just feels broken. It's a real shame too, because without these handling issues, this car would be a rocket. Ultimately, for me, the Deltawing is one of the most disappointing cars in the history of this franchise. It promised so much, but delivered so little. And I suppose that's in keeping with its real-life story. After failing to finish at Le Mans in 2012, the car was raced for 4 seasons in the ALMS, later IMSA, where it was largely unsuccessful. After that, it was retired, and that's where its story ends. In GT6, even if you can cure its handling problems, the fact that both cars are so overrated in the performance point system means that you will almost always have better options. For comparison, the 2012 Deltawing is rated significantly higher than the Toyota TS030, an LMP1 car which qualified almost 18 seconds faster than it at Le Mans in 2012. Of course, the performance of each car in this game is not exactly the same as real life, but let me tell you, that rating is not true to the game either. The Deltawing is an oddity, not just in real life, but also in Gran Turismo. From the legal complications surrounding its inclusion, to the way it drives and even its performance point rating, everything about it is unusual. In some regards, I wouldn't expect anything less. In this video, we've looked at a number of weird and wonderful machines, so you're probably thinking that I've saved the best for last. Well, this final entry is a little bit different, and as such, requires a bit of an explanation. So, Gran Turismo 3. Longtime viewers should already know that this game is my favourite in the entire series. Whilst it has significantly less content in terms of cars and tracks than any of the other games outside of the original, it boasts an impressive level of quality in every aspect. The fact that this game came out in 2001 still blows my mind. But more importantly, it's what the game does with its limited content that I find so special. In most GT games, you don't really have a reason to engage with the majority of the cars over the course of a playthrough. Arguably, in some of these titles, there are just so many that it simply wouldn't be possible, at least not without making the main career thousands of hours long. The beauty of GT3 is that they were able to make use of pretty much every single car within this game in one form or another. Whether it be given out as a prize, or the designated car for a certain license test, or even just an AI opponent in one of the events, by playing through this game, you will experience almost every make and model in it in some way. It's exactly this reason why GT3 still manages to be a full Gran Turismo experience in spite of its reduced roster. Is this game guilty of sometimes overusing these cars? Absolutely, but I still prefer this over the inverse problem. Anyway, one day I got a bit curious and decided to test my hypothesis by checking how many of the 180 so cars in this game get used for different things. My criteria was what I've already outlined: prize car, license test car, opponent car. And what I discovered was pretty much what I was expecting. Almost every car fits into at least one of these categories. Emphasis on almost, because there is one model that doesn't get used for anything, which I believe makes it undoubtedly the most irrelevant car in GT3. That model in question is the 2001 Acura CL Type S. Yep. Well, I said that this final entry was going to be something different, and by different, I meant boring. Yes, the Acura CL is not particularly interesting, but I think that's what makes it being an outlier in GT3 kind of fascinating. Now, I know what some of you will be thinking. You can just buy this car from the dealers if you really want to, so what's the big deal? Well, even then, I struggle to think of any situation in which you would. This model does have the distinction of being the most powerful front-wheel drive road car, which is something. However, its relatively high weight means that its performance is lackluster. If you're looking for a car that ticks all of the same boxes, you would almost certainly go for the Integra Type R instead, which is also quite a bit cheaper. Basically, unless you have some sort of affinity for this model, there is no reason to drive it. I'm willing to bet that 95% of people who've played GT3 have never touched this car or even seen it outside of the dealership. In fact, its lack of visibility when compared to everything else made me wonder whether it was absent from the original Japanese version of the game and only added in later releases. But after checking this myself, no, it is there, which to be honest, only makes me more confused. Now, when I said that the CL was the only car that didn't fit any of my 3 criteria, I wasn't telling the whole truth. There is another, the 1996 Subaru Legacy Touring Wagon GTB. But I don't think it's fair to lump this car in with the CL for 2 reasons. 1, there are other legacies in this game which do get used, and 2, this car is a very common opponent in arcade mode B-class races. I wasn't able to find a definitive list of arcade mode opponents, hence why I didn't include it in my criteria, but I can say that I don't recall ever racing against the CL in this mode either. How this car ended up being so overlooked in this game is a bit of a mystery, but I do have another theory. Alphabetically, the Acura CL is the first car in the game, so is it possible that some coding error caused it to be removed from certain lists, for example, opponents for each event? This is entirely just speculation, so take it with a grain of salt. Beyond GT3, there isn't much else to say about its appearances in future games. The car would return in GT4, where it was joined by its 2003 version, and they were both carried into the PS3 games as standard models. They still weren't used for a whole lot, but you could say that about most cars in these games, so that's nothing out of the ordinary. Interestingly, starting with the PS3 games, a very low-res CL can be found as a scenery vehicle, and it still appears even now in GT7. The model seems to be based on the 2001 version, but with the wheels from the 2003 car. And, well, there you are. That was the story of the least interesting car in Gran Turismo. Understandably, the Acura CL is probably not going to be the car that first comes to mind when you picture Gran Turismo 3. Or maybe it is and you just don't realize it, because there is one small detail that may blow your mind. You know the North American box art for the game? It shows the rear of a car with the GT3 logo superimposed on it. Well, on page 40 of the game's manual, we can find confirmation that this car is in fact the Acura CL Type S. Yes, to represent the game, they chose the one car that doesn't get used for anything within it. I swear, you couldn't come up with this stuff if you tried. As we come to the end of another season of Gran Turismo's most memorable cars, I think it's time to once again take a trip to the Hall of Fame. There are interesting cars in Gran Turismo, and then there are the cars that have had a tangible impact on the history of this series. You may remember that a couple of years ago, I made a video talking about models exactly like this. From the big 3 90s Japanese Le Mans cars, through to the poster child Castrol Tom Supra, and even an overlooked icon, the Nismo GTR LM. To me, cars like these hold a special place in this franchise, as without them, things just wouldn't be quite the same. Some of them may predate the series itself, but they are iconic Gran Turismo cars through and through. However, it speaks volumes about the depth of this series' car roster that I'm able to bring you a second round of Gran Turismo legends. Now, make no mistake, these cars may have missed out the first time, but that doesn't mean they're any less impactful to this series. In fact, there are even one or two that I'm kinda shocked I've never covered in these videos before. We have some real big hitters here, including a few whose contributions to this series I don't think get appreciated often enough. Back in that previous Icons of Gran Turismo video, one model which I highlighted was the mid-2000s Ford GT, along with its LM race car variants. Given its intrinsic link to GT4, the game which many consider to be the greatest in the series, along with the fact that Kaz himself owned 2 of them, this made it a very obvious pick. But if you ask me, when it comes to American cars with a legacy in Gran Turismo, there is one that I think eclipses even the GT. There weren't many non-Japanese cars in the original Gran Turismo, just 16 in total across 4 different brands. But if you were to ask the average player to name a non-Japanese car that appeared in GT1, the first one that would spring to their mind would most likely be Viper. The Dodge Viper may be an automotive icon in current day, but you have to remember that when the original Gran Turismo debuted, it had only been around for a handful of years. At this point, there really isn't much to say about the car that you don't already know. A gargantuan 8-litre V10 co-developed by Lamborghini sends power to the rear wheels. In GT1, there are 3 variants of the Viper: the GTS Coupe, the GTSR racing version, and the RT10 Roadster. The original Roadster would only ever appear in the PS1 era, ending up vastly overshadowed by the GTS, which had something of a starring role in its debut game. Most notably, 5 of the 10 license tests in the final International A grade use this car. Although, when it comes to license tests with the Viper, there is one that's particularly memorable in GT2. This game's IB10 has you navigating Laguna Seca's famous corkscrew in a Viper GTS, which is no easy feat. This exact setup also gets replicated in GT3's IA5 and GT7's IA6. It seems that Polyphony think that Laguna Seca and the Viper just go together, and I guess that's not too surprising. During the development of GT2, the Gran Turismo team actually visited Laguna Seca and drove the track with a Viper GTS. As you can see, getting it through the corkscrew in real life is just as tricky as it is in-game. But on the topic of license tests, I have to say that my standout memory of the Viper is actually GT3's B2. Despite only being the second test in the game, you're given the reins to this V10 beast. Sure, it may just be a stop-start test, but compared to the Beetle in B1, it feels worlds apart. As a kid, this test was almost certainly my introduction to the Viper, and it left a big impression on me. When it comes to the single-player races, in the first few games, the Viper was always a tough opponent when it appeared, particularly in the US-themed events such as Stars and Stripes. The Viper GTSR also isn't to be taken lightly. Built by French constructor Oreca, the version of the car we see in GT1 is, like many race cars in this game, an unlicensed version. From GT2, the real Viper GTSR also appeared, listed as a 1999 model year, but actually appearing to be the car that finished second in class at Le Mans in 1998. This car was also joined by the STP Taisan Viper that competed in the All Japan GT Championship in 1999. Like all JGTC cars in this game, its output is quite overrated at almost 650 horsepower. Given that the GTSR makes nearly 700 horsepower, both cars are very competitive in late game events. However, moving on to GT3, neither would return. They would instead be replaced by the 2000 version of the GTSR. For many, this Viper is one of the hero cars of GT3, particularly in North America. However, if you were playing the NTSCU version of this game, your Viper GTSR would look slightly different. Here, it appears as the number 91 machine that won the GTS class of the American Le Mans series in 2000. In other versions of GT3, we got the very similar looking number 51 car, that instead dominated the GTS class at Le Mans that same year. The other major difference is that this one is not listed as a Dodge, but a Chrysler, as it was in real life. In GT4, the Dodge-badged ALMS version is used in all regions, and in the PS3 games, both appear as separate models. No discussion about the Viper in Gran Turismo would be complete without also mentioning the GTSR concept, which debuted in GT3. Whilst its radical styling makes it look out of this world, it only has about 500 horsepower, so performance is good, but not unbelievably so. Notably, in GT3, it's actually one of the hardest cars to acquire, as the only methods to do so are winning the Professional GT All-Stars events, where you have a 1 in 4 chance of receiving it, or getting all golds on the Super License. Talk about a high barrier to entry. Whilst versions of the first generation Viper would continue to appear in future games, it really feels like the first 3 titles were when they were at their peak. From GT4, the second gen Viper finally replaced it, and we then saw the third and so far final iteration appear from GT6 onwards. In case you hadn't realised by now, when I talk about the Viper being a Gran Turismo legend, I am mainly referring to the first gen SR model. Don't get me wrong, the later versions are memorable in their own right, the second gen ACR being a particular favourite of mine. However, they just don't have that same connection to the series as the original. Want to know a pretty incredible fact that doesn't get talked about often enough? Out of all the cars to ever feature in this series, the first generation Viper GTS is the only non-Japanese model to have appeared in every single mainline entry. Yes, really. Although the model year may have shifted slightly, this car has been an almost ever-present fixture of this series. Not considering different variations of the same car, there are fewer than 20 other models that can claim the same tenure in GT as the Viper, all of which being the JDM legends that we expect. There are real-world similarities between them and the Viper too. Not only were they produced around the same time, there are parallels when it comes to their perception and legacy. For instance, when the FC RX-7 came out, it was labelled by many as an obvious copy of the Porsche 944. The NSX, on the other hand, was clearly Honda's take on a Ferrari. It's quite well known that the Viper was Chrysler's attempt to recreate the Shelby Cobra, down to even the name. The design of the GTS Coupe was also heavily inspired by the Cobra Daytona. But, much like the RX-7 and NSX, the Viper has outgrown its label as a shameless rip-off and become an icon in its own right. If I had to guess, I'd say that people like me who grew up playing these games and idolizing these cars are part of the reason why that perception has changed. In spite of how different they appear, personally, I hold the Dodge Viper in a similar regard to those 90s Japanese sports cars. It hits all of the same marks, except for its country of origin. I appreciate that if you're from the US, this comparison won't really make much sense. I guess the nearest equivalent would be the TVRs, given how Gran Turismo elevated their global appeal. But even then, they don't really have the same lasting impact. As a European whose love for cars stems from playing these games at a young age, in my mind, the first gen Viper fills a similar niche to stuff like the NSX, Supra, GTR, etc. I guess what I'm trying to say is that to me, the Viper is a JDM legend that doesn't come from Japan. Like it or loathe it, Vision Gran Turismo is a cornerstone of the franchise in modern day. In fact, a Vision GT car even appears on the cover art of GT7, indicating just how important they are to the series. Officially, the first ever Vision GT car was the Mercedes AMG, which debuted with the release of GT6 in late 2013. However, Gran Turismo working with a real-world brand to create a concept car specifically for the game had been seen before. The Nike one that appears in GT4 is the model that will most likely come to mind. But whilst it certainly fits the mould of a Vision GT car, for me, the whole project kind of stands as a curious oddity. After all, Nike are a clothing brand, not a car company. Also, as far as I can tell, Gran Turismo had little to no input, with the whole concept being drawn up by designer Phil Frank. If we want to find the first true Vision GT car, we have to skip forward a few years. The 2008 Paris Motor Show saw the unveiling of this, the oddly named GT by Citroën. This concept was a complete departure for Citroën, being an all-electric supercar which only took vague styling cues from their production models. Although it first appeared in-game through GT5 Prologue's Spec 3 updates, in which it also became the cover car of the game, the idea for the GT actually dates back all the way to 2003. Yes, before the Nike One even existed. It supposedly came about through a conversation between series producer Kazunori Yamauchi and a personal friend called Takumi Yamamoto. At the time, Yamamoto was a designer for PSA Group, and he was responsible for the Citroën's dramatic styling. Although it was originally conceived as just a rolling concept that could only be driven in-game, demand for it was so great that Citroën were convinced to give it a limited production run of 6 examples. However, turning the GT into a real functioning car presented one major problem. The technology required for its supposed electric powertrain didn't actually exist, and so a distinctly less advanced solution was needed. In the end, it was decided to fit the GT with a 5.4-litre naturally aspirated V8 that made in excess of 500 horsepower. It's strongly speculated that this engine was a Ford modular unit, although that's never been officially confirmed by Citroën for obvious reasons. Sadly, in the end, the GT would never make it into production, as Citroën realised that even if they were to sell all 6 of them for over €1 million each, they would still make a significant loss on every one. Coming off the back of a financial crisis, that wouldn't have been the smartest idea. In the end, only one V8 engine example was ever made. But the good news was that when the full Gran Turismo 5 released towards the end of 2010, this car was included alongside the prototype version. Performance-wise, it is quite a bit slower than its electric counterparts, making only 500 horsepower compared to 780, despite also costing 2 million credits. But even so, it is pretty cool seeing this more realistic road car spec of the GT in-game as well. One strange decision is that whilst the concept version was available in 20 different paint colours in GT5 Prologue, in GT5 it only comes in white. All of those colours were instead transferred over to the road car. But beyond the prototype and the road car, there is a third GT in this game. Prior to the release of GT5, a racing version of the Citroën was revealed. Yamamoto was brought back on to work on its design, which involved the addition of some aggressive aero. Notably, this car appears on the event thumbnail for the Dream Car Championship, an event in which it's usually one of the frontrunners should it turn up as an opponent. 5.6 million credits is a hefty price to pay if you want one yourself, but thankfully you can instead win it from the B-Spec version of this event. GT6 would see all 3 of these models return, and with their prices slashed as well. Whilst it would have been easy for the GT story in this franchise to begin and end on the PS3, it did manage to make the transition onto the next generation. From launch, GT Sport included 3 versions of the car, but they weren't the exact same 3 as before. The road car was carried over, but the battery-powered prototype wasn't for unknown reasons. The race car also made the jump, albeit in a slightly modified form to fit into the Group 3 class. Back when GT Sport first came out, this car was kind of an outlier. It was the only returning original race car to appear in this class, with the majority of others either being real-world GT3 machines, or new original race cars designed in the mold of a GT3 machine. To allow Citroën to compete in the manufacturer series, the GT also got a Group 4 version, and it too stood out quite a bit compared to its rivals. Once again, Takumi Yamamoto was in charge of the design, but it's worth noting that by this point, he had left PSA and actually worked for Polyphony Digital for a few years. In GT7, the situation with this car is still pretty much the same. As Citroën doesn't have any other cars that would really work in Groups 3 or 4, it's likely that the GT will continue to be its flagship racing model in these games. I hope that through explaining all of this, you've been able to see that the number of parallels between this car and Vision GT as a whole is quite astounding. In fact, despite being created together with Gran Turismo, the Citroën has gone on to appear in a handful of other racing games, much like some Vision GTs. As of writing, there have been 40 different brands who've been involved with Vision Gran Turismo since its inception, but Citroën isn't one of them. Or is it? Because I think it's pretty clear to see that the GT by Citroën is the prototypical Vision GT car, without officially being part of the project. Part of me almost wonders if it should be retroactively categorized as a Vision GT given the similarities, but I guess it doesn't really matter. Even though it's been somewhat overshadowed by the many other concepts since then, there's no doubt that the GT by Citroën is a very influential car in the history of this series. To understand its significance is to understand how and why Vision GT got to where it is today. Whilst the GT by Citroën and Nike 1 were envisioned as futuristic concept cars, when it came to their performance, they were still fairly grounded in reality. But there was a prototype machine which debuted in GT5 that made even full-on race cars look pedestrian by comparison. First teased in September 2010 and then fully revealed 1 month later, this is the Red Bull X1, a car designed to answer a single question posed by Kaz. Ignoring any rules or regulations, what is the fastest possible racing car you could create? To help him answer this, Gran Turismo teamed up with Red Bull Racing and their chief F1 designer at the time, Adrian Newey. Together with Kaz, he designed the ultimate formula car. Almost 1500 horsepower from a twin-turbo V6, a super sleek design incorporating wheel covers and a canopy, and then the piste resistance, a fan that literally sucks the car to the ground. This aspect came from Newey himself, inspired by past fan cars such as the Chaparral 2J, a model which was already familiar to Gran Turismo players. The X1 was given a shakedown in the virtual world by then Red Bull F1 driver Sebastian Vettel, and reportedly lapped some 20 seconds faster than the F1 record, clearly showing the immense potential of the car. Players would get their hands on this machine with the release of GT5, where it was soon renamed to the Red Bull X 2010 owing to possible trademark concerns. As for its speed in-game, it certainly lived up to expectations. There was simply no debate regarding which car was the fastest in GT5, like with previous entries. It was the X 2010. Easily. It's worth remembering that much like in prior games, most race events in GT5 don't have performance restrictions. This means that you can use this car to bulldoze through the career if you want to. To balance this, getting your hands on one is rather tricky though. If you want to buy it, not only do you have to save up the maximum 20 million credits, but you also have to reach level 40. Uniquely, the X 2010 doesn't appear in the dealership at all until you hit level 30, which I don't think occurs with any other model in this game. However, there are some alternative methods. For reaching level 35 in B-Spec mode, you're given an X 2010 as a reward, and you can even get your hands on one as early as level 30 through completing the Sebastian Vettel X Challenge. This special event serves as a showcase for not only the car, but Gran Turismo's partnership with Red Bull, as it features Vettel himself, in all of his mildly disturbing PS3 spec glory. As I've covered a few times already on this channel, this event is notable for being extremely difficult, especially on a standard controller. Whilst the bronze targets for each of the 3 time trials are fairly lenient, silver and gold require some serious dedication. Fortunately, all bronze is all you need to get the X 2010 in full Red Bull livery, with silver giving you the normal version, and for all gold you get the carbon fiber prototype. Actually, there was an even easier way to get this car, as it was given out to every player who logged into GT5 for a couple of weeks during October 2011. This was done to celebrate Vettel winning his second F1 World Championship in real life. Around the same time, the Racing Car Pack DLC was made available, and it included an updated X 2011 model. This version was even faster than the X 2010, boasting increased power and improved aero thanks to a different rear wing design. Moving on to GT6, the car would evolve once again into the X 2014, introduced in version 1.04. Whilst the total power output was reduced by around 300 horsepower, further aerodynamic improvements were made. Given that this car is still supposed to follow the same ethos of the fastest theoretical racing car, I'm not really sure why they decided to detune the engine. Perhaps it had something to do with the introduction of the X 2014 Standard and X 2014 Junior. These 2 models served to flesh out the Red Bull X lineup beyond just the fan car. The Standard looked similar to it, but had less performance on account of its increased weight, reduced power, and removal of the fans entirely. The Junior was kind of its own thing, sort of like a Formula 3 car with bodywork styled on the X 2014. Each of them would have their own event in the revamped Red Bull X Challenge, which is thankfully nowhere near as difficult as in GT5. Again, achieving at least bronze will win you the respective car, but you can also buy them from the dealership along with the X 2010 and X 2011 if you want to. At just 6 million credits, the fan cars are a steal compared to GT5. But with the introduction of the SRT Tomahawk X Vision GT in version 1.20, the Red Bull fan cars were no longer the obvious benchmark. In terms of straight-line performance, the Tomahawk clearly has them beat, but the Red Bulls are better in the corners. Overall, it's pretty track dependent on which of them appears faster, but at just 1 million credits, the Tomahawk is much better value. With the release of GT Sport, to begin with there were no Red Bull X cars, but this did change through updates. March 2018 saw the return of both the X 2014 Junior and Standard. The Standard model soon became popular for its use in FIA Nations Cup races, but it was felt that the racing spectacle could be better. The end result of that desire was this. the X2019 competition. This car was originally used only in FIA live events, before being fully added to the game in June 2019. In terms of spec, it's almost identical to the X2014, save for a couple of important differences. For one, the turbocharged V6 engine has been replaced with an NA V12, which makes a more aggressive sound. Additionally, its downforce has been massively reduced to mitigate the effect of dirty air, and thus make it easier for cars to follow each other. These changes saw the Red Bull only get more attention through its Nations Cup appearances. In fact, when the Spec 2 version of GT Sport dropped later that year, the X2019 became the game's cover car. Moving on to GT7, whilst it isn't quite as prominent, the X2019 competition is still a staple of sport mode and the live events. To signify the car's importance to this series, a special 25th anniversary edition was created and given out to players across the end of 2022 and into 2023. When it comes to the Red Bull X story in Gran Turismo, there is one loose end that needs to be addressed. What happened to the fan car? After all, the fan element was a crucial part of the original car's design, and yet post GT6, we've only seen these lower performance spin-off versions. When you think about it, it's kind of a bizarre situation. I mean, it's not as if insanely fast prototypes have been banished from the series. The Tomahawk X is proof of that. It's just interesting to observe how the purpose of the Red Bull X series has shifted from being the fastest possible racing car to a one-make racer that was deliberately nerfed for the sake of entertainment. Given just how long the fan car has been absent, it seems like Polyphony don't have a very strong desire to bring it back. But you can never say never. Although, what I think is really unique is that even though it's been well over a decade since its last appearance, the fan car has actually become more popular since then. The X2010 has been modded into various different games and sims, Assetto Corsa being the most well known. This has allowed a new audience of people to experience the fan car. I know that there are some out there who've never touched a Gran Turismo game, and yet are still aware of that crazy fast Red Bull thing. This is a rare case of a car being designed for Gran Turismo, having its legacy added to by its appearances in games beyond Gran Turismo, albeit not officially. Including this one, I've now made 9 separate videos diving into the most interesting and memorable cars throughout this franchise. However, from sifting through the comments on them, there is one car that I get asked to talk about far more than any other. That model in question? The Suzuki Escudo Pikes Peak. There is just one problem with that though. I already have. Back in June of 2023, I uploaded Gran Turismo Meme Cars Explained, the initial video which kicked off this entire series in fact. Naturally, the Escudo was featured on account of its GT3 wheelie antics. But to be entirely honest, this car is so much more than just a meme. In fact, it could have easily fit in many of the videos I've made since then. Because of this, I'm finally going to answer these requests by making a special exception to my rule of not covering the same car twice. First of all, let's answer a question that some people may still be wondering. What the f is an Escudo? Well, it's a compact SUV made by Suzuki that you might otherwise know as the Vitara in Europe and Australia, or the Sidekick in North America. The word Escudo means shield in Portuguese, and was also the name of their currency prior to the euro. The car that we were introduced to in GT2 is virtually unrelated to a real Escudo. This is a purpose-built hill climb car weighing just 800 kilograms and pushing out almost 1000 horsepower from its twin-turbo V6. The Escudo Pikes Peak is extraordinarily fast in GT2, easily overshadowing its older brother, the Cultus Pikes Peak, which I covered previously. The combination of low weight, high power, extreme downforce, and a mid-engine all-wheel drive layout is a near-perfect setup in this game. Whether you're driving on gravel, such as at Pikes Peak, the course that it was designed to race at in real life, or at any of the tarmac circuits, the Escudo is pretty much unstoppable. If this car had only ever appeared in GT2, this would have been enough to cement its near-mythical reputation. But the story is far from finished. Although GT3 saw a dramatic reduction in the number of cars for the sake of increased fidelity, the Pikes Peak Escudo was one of the lucky few to make the transition. I suppose that given its fan favourite status from GT2, that made the decision to include it a lot easier. In this game, you can purchase it for just 1 million credits, half of what it cost in the previous entry. If not, you will also receive it as a prize for completing all of the rally events, which I think is very fitting. It has to be said that the car's performance in this game is noticeably not as good as it was in GT2. On tarmac in particular, it's somewhat prone to understeer, and there is a fair amount of turbo lag as well. Whilst it is still far from slow, it does get outshone by the high-end prototypes and GT cars. But the Escudo does have one trick up its sleeve. I covered this pretty extensively in the Mean Cars video, so I won't go into as much detail here, but by applying a specific tuning setup, you can get this car to pull off a sick wheelie. Due to how GT3's physics engine works, this tricks the game into thinking the car is continuously falling, and thus allows it to accelerate infinitely. This gimmick is only really useful at the test course, where you can get up to some insane speeds, and if combined with an out of bounds glitch, enables you to well and truly break the game. Moving on to GT4, the more realistic handling model further limited the Escudo's ability. The only way to get the car in this game is by winning Rally Yosemite 1 hard. Doing this is tricky, but not incredibly so given the opponents you can come up against. As such, winning the Escudo here actually represents a decent progression skip. One interesting note is that in this game, and also GT5, the car is renamed to the Escudo Dirt Trial car. Dirt Trial is a racing discipline that's quite popular in Japan, and it's one where the real-life driver of the Escudo, Nobuhiro Tajima, was very successful. However, as far as I can tell, this Escudo never competed in Dirt Trial events, only hill climbs. This makes Escudo Dirt Trial car something of a misnomer, but it would revert back to Escudo Pikes Peak from GT6. Speaking of which, the car would reappear as a PS2 carryover in the PS3 games, but it isn't particularly memorable in either. You can face it as an opponent in the high-speed Like the Wind events, but it's never one of the frontrunners. Massive wings like these produce a lot of downforce, but also a lot of drag, which severely limits its top speed. Here's a fun fact. The 6 that appears on the box art of Gran Turismo 6 happens to look very similar to the one on the Escudo's rear wing. Coincidence or sly reference? I'll let you decide. Like most things that people associated with the older games, the Escudo was not brought back for GT Sports. During this period, it did however make a rare non-Gran Turismo appearance in 2016's Sebastian Loeb Rally Evo, by way of a Pikes Peak themed DLC pack. This was the car's most recent virtual outing, until it made a surprise return in the June 2022 update for Gran Turismo 7. You might have noticed a theme in that the more realistic the games become, the worse the Escudo gets relative to everything else. The reason for this is that their way of figuring out performance in the older games wasn't incredibly sophisticated. It mainly just boiled down to weight, power, and aero, 3 areas which the Escudo excelled in, allowing it to effectively game the system. But as we know, there are many more factors at play in reality, and when looking at the car's depiction in GT7, this is very obvious. In standard form, the V6 used in the Escudo made barely 150 horsepower. To up that to just shy of 1000 required the additional turbos to be supplying a lot of boost. But as this was the late 90s, turbo lag was still very much an issue, and this gives the car its characteristic peaky nature in GT7. When you're not on boost, the Escudo has nothing to give. The version 1.59 update added the ability to swap in the high-revving V8 from the Suzuki Vision GT Group 3. Doing this massively improved the Escudo's responsiveness, but at the cost of peak power. Add to this the increased drag of its oversized aero, and regardless of which engine you use, on road circuits it's nowhere near as potent as it previously was. It wasn't designed to drive on tarmac circuits in real life, so this makes sense. When driving off-road, it is still the clear benchmark, but this isn't actually a good thing. Because of its wildly different performance, the car is not included in the game's Group B Rally category, which severely limits its usability. To be honest, even if it were, it still wouldn't make a great difference, due to just how irrelevant rally racing is in GT7. Whilst it's great to have this car in the series in current day, given its impact and legacy, fundamentally, there isn't much you can use it for. The only single-player event where it kinda fits is the Neo Classic competition, in which it also appears as an opponent. Touching on the car's real-life story, the record books will tell you that Nobuhiro Monster Tajima drove an Escudo to overall victory at Pikes Peak in both 1995 and 2006. However, neither of these were the Gran Turismo Escudo. The 95 car was Pikes Peak Escudo Mark I, a twin-engine design much like the aforementioned Cultus. The car with the twin-turbo V6, Escudo Mark II, actually debuted in 1996, with the version in Gran Turismo being modelled on its 98 iteration. This car was used through to 2001, before being replaced with Escudo Mark III. The central driving position is the biggest giveaway that this isn't the same chassis. This is the car that would win at Pikes Peak in 2006. All of this means that the Pikes Peak Escudo, which became a global icon thanks to Gran Turismo, never actually won the event that it was named after. It competed on 5 occasions between 1996 and 2001, achieving a best result of 2nd overall 3 separate times. On each occasion, it would be bested by Tajima's arch-rival, Rod Millen, using first an IMSA GTP-powered Toyota Celica, and later Toyota Tacoma. The Escudo wasn't a complete failure though, as it did manage to win the Race to the Sky in New Zealand 3 times, another hill climb that could be considered the sister event to Pikes Peak. Given the car's speed in GT2 in particular, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it was a dominant machine in real life. In spite of its iconic status, we have to admit that the reasons why it became so memorable in Gran Turismo are mainly due to oversights with the games. Firstly, how it exploited GT2's simplistic performance calculations to become the de facto fastest car, when it realistically should have been nowhere close, and then how it exploited GT3's physics engine to pull off its game-breaking wheelies, a feat which it shares with only the Toyota GT1. Add to this the misconception surrounding its real-life accomplishments, and this car truly is an anomaly. In fact, there's even some debate as to whether it still exists in real life. I wasn't able to find a concrete answer, but it's believed that it was taken apart and used as spares for Tajima's later machines. This would explain why there are no pictures or videos of the real car beyond the early 2000s. Given its status in Gran Turismo, that might seem unthinkable. But when you look at all of Tajima's Pikes Peak specials and what they each achieved, this version of the Escudo is arguably one of the least significant. I'd wager that if it weren't for Gran Turismo, there's a good chance that no one would really talk about it. When you consider that this car is now instantly recognizable to millions of people all over the world, it once again goes to show the sheer level of influence Gran Turismo had during its golden era. Whether it be a car that was designed specifically for the game, a model that's gone on to appear in every mainline title, or one that's featured in a particularly memorable way, there are many different reasons for how a car can end up as a Gran Turismo legend. But when looking at all of the models that have ever been included in these games, for me, there is one that I think has a special bond with this series, unlike any other. That car is the Nissan GT-R. At this point, the R35 GT-R is such a common sight in racing games that it's honestly quite easy to overlook its significance here. In real life, the GT-R had an extremely prolonged run. It was on sale for 18 continuous years, from 2007 to 2025. I think that longevity is a major factor in how it got so much exposure through this series, and not just in the games. The story dates all the way back to the original concept surprise unveiling at the 2001 Tokyo Motor Show. Just over 2 months later, the car would appear in the spin-off title Gran Turismo Concept 2001 Tokyo, where not only is it the cover car, but it also features heavily in the opening movie. Even from day one, it got a spotlight in Gran Turismo. In the years after this, work on the real car progressed in the background, and it wouldn't be until GT5 Prologue in 2007 that the story would continue. This game featured the updated 2005 GT-R Proto, but also the final production version. Initially, the Japanese demo of the game included the GT-R Black Mask, effectively the same car, but with parts of its exterior obscured. When the real GT-R was unveiled at the 2007 Tokyo Motor Show, so too was it unveiled in the game, replacing the Black Mask version from that point onwards, although it would return as a separate model in GT5 and GT6. One quite significant thing is that Polyphony were actually involved in the design of the real car. They worked on the multifunction display, and there are some pretty clear similarities between it and the UI elements in GT5 Prologue. Given the connection, it's not at all surprising that it's the hero car of this game. When the full GT5 released in 2010, the era of the GTR was well underway, and Polyphony would lean into this. Alongside all of the versions we've already talked about, this game would include the 2009 Spec V, and later the 2012 Black Edition as part of a DLC pack. As the car continued to evolve in real life, the games would keep up. GT6 introduced the high-performance 2014 Nismo model. At launch, GT Sport included the 2017 Premium Edition, and this would later be joined by the 2017 Nismo. The final variant of this car to appear in Gran Turismo is the 2024 Premium Edition T-Spec, which was added to GT7 in October 2024. This is the last version of the R35 GTR to ever roll off the production line. When it comes to racing variants, there's a long lineage here too. In GT Concept, they created a fictional LM version of the 2001 show car, with a livery inspired by the R391 Le Mans prototype. That's pretty damn cool. Once again skipping ahead to GT5, the Spec 2 update would bring the 2011 N24 Schulze Motorsport car, and also the fictional touring car which was available as paid DLC. The 2012 N24 GT Academy car would also be introduced this way not long after. GT6 saw the debut of the GTR GT3, available in various different colour schemes. GT Sport carried over the GT3, but it did also add an original Group 4 car, and most interestingly, a Group B rally version. All of these models returned in GT7 alongside the updated 2018 GT3, which debuted in the October 2022 updates. That's of course not mentioning the models which are GTR in name only, such as the GT500 cars, and also the GTR LM Nismo. Whilst there have certainly been cars with more variations throughout this series, I don't think that any other model can match the sheer depth and variety as the GTRs. Almost every significant version of this car over the course of the past 25 years has been represented, from the initial prototype all the way to its final evolution. For me, the only other version that I would have liked to see included is the FIA GT1 car, but you can't have it all, I suppose. Hell, there's even a GTR safety car. What more could you really want? As I alluded to before, the connection between the GTR and GT transcends the games themselves. This is another car that Kaz has owned in real life, and not only that, he's raced it too. Both the 2011 Schulze Motorsport car and 2012 GT Academy version were driven by Kaz at the Nürburgring 24 Hours, in which his team achieved class victory both times. He would also race a GTR GT3 at the event in 2013 and 2014, but with less success. Reports of these races were previously available on the short-lived Gran Turismo TV service, but they've since been archived on the series' official YouTube channel. Arguably, an even more important aspect to consider is GT Academy. The Gamer to Racer competition/reality show was funded by Nissan from the very beginning. Running from 2008 to 2016, these were the years when the GTR was at its peak in terms of relevance, and so it's not surprising that Nissan's flagship sports car featured pretty heavily in it. But it didn't end there, because once those gamers graduated to professional drivers, many of them ended up racing GTRs. In fact, some of the greatest achievements by GT Academy alumni came from behind the wheel of one, and this includes a certain Jan Mardenborough. His story was the focal point of the 2023 Gran Turismo movie, in which the GTR GT3 is one of the hero cars. To commemorate this, the movie livery was then made available in GT7. So, to summarize everything, this is a car that Polyphony themselves had a hand in developing, a car which the creator of the series owned and raced in real life, and a car which was a crucial part of the GT Academy program, leading to it becoming the star of a film named after and based on the series itself. Add to this its extensive in-game lineage, and frankly there is no other model that even comes close to its legacy. I've said before that the Castrol Tom Supra is the car of Gran Turismo, but that's mainly due to its historical significance dating all the way back to the original game. Whilst the R35 GTR didn't exist until Gran Turismo was already well established, the fact that you can almost consider it as an equal to the Castrol Supra speaks volumes about its importance to this franchise. In many ways, I feel like it embodies what this series is all about more than any other model. A super advanced Japanese masterpiece that conquered the world. In fact, the real GT3 machine is still out there winning races to this day, 15 years on from its debut. The discontinuation of the R35 GTR represents the end of an era for not just Nissan, but Gran Turismo too.